All right. Well, let's jump into some slides and some content. And for some of you, CCA2, you've seen some of these slides. This is what would generally be the start of week 10. But I think from the conversation that we've had so far this morning that this quote applies to a lot of the case in points and a lot of the 6-word updates. This book, it's from How to Fly a Horse. You've heard us talk about it. It's one of my favorite books. It's up there with Predictably Irrational. It says Kevin Ashton says, the greatest test of your expertise is how explicitly you understand your assumptions. And that sort of goes back to several things that I think were shared in the 6-word updates. For example, when Nick says all or nothing thinking, not trying to pick on you, Renee, but there's a certain assumption that we might make about what that means to us in that situation, right? And so then how explicitly do we actually understand the assumption that we're making? I think we had a conversation, I don't remember what group it was in, about being right. Alan, I think maybe you might have shared something in a 6-word update a couple of weeks ago, in that assumption that we might make about trying to be right. And what if we just pivot it from, how do I know that I'm right? Right? That's testing my assumption. I think I'm right, but how do I actually know that I'm right? And that's taken from Ray Dalio, and it's a similar angle on this concept of how explicitly do we understand our assumptions, really trying to get to the essence of it. What are the biases to the extent to which we can unravel those that are operative in this moment? Does anybody have any reflection on that? Nick, anything you want to add on to it?
I'll just give an example, because I like to use a bunch of different domains, is you call up a nutritionist, or you're sitting next to one right now, and they see like, oh, you're eating white rice, you should totally eat brown rice instead. What assumptions are they making? Right? Like that they know what I'm trying to accomplish, that I'm trying to lose weight, I might not be trying to lose weight, that I have health issues, I might not have any health issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you see it a lot in, if any of you are in Moonshot and see me talk to Dr. Satoshi, TB, a lot of times we're having these conversations and he's very much a Bitcoin, we call it a Bitcoin maxi. He loves Bitcoin, he knows a lot about Bitcoin. He's actually a pretty smart guy. But very, very poor communicator, because he's made, when you adopt a belief and you adopt a paradigm, you adopt a set of assumptions, and with those set of assumptions, also a set of blinders. So do you understand the blinders that you've adopted? And those assumptions, and Dan and I both actually do this, you've probably heard us say, well, it's my bias that this, right? Or I'm making the assumption that you want to achieve this, and if that's the case, XYZ. Right? So it's a process of always trying to make sure that when we're talking to somebody, that we are recognizing the assumptions we're making. And we're making it explicit so that you also know the assumptions I'm making, so that you can, if you're operating under a different set of assumptions, then we can have an effective conversation. So I think it's, you go to the gym. People assume you want to lose weight. It's an assumption. It's right a lot of times, but we have to be aware that we're making that assumption if we're going to communicate with this person and help them. Does that make sense? So that awareness is very rare. It's very important, I think.
I have found that language around my bias to be an ace card in accelerating a rapport or some authority in a new relationship. Say someone I'm trying to influence or we want as an ally in things we're doing in our businesses. I used to say my assumption, but the contrast in saying my bias is so startling. Like, oh, bias. Okay, you're being really explicit here. Most people don't even recognize to begin with that they're biased. They spend a lot of time saying everyone else is biased, but for someone to explicitly say my bias in this situation is XYZ, it gets their attention. So it is a tactic that works highly effective in influencing other folks, because now they understand the bias that you have, and they go, oh, okay, you actually know that you're biased. That's cool. I trust you a little bit more, that you're going to be transparent with me, because you know that you're biased, you're being upfront with it. there's this whole notion, have you guys heard about gotcha moments? This concept. So I'm going to totally botch probably the psychology behind it all, but we're wired for sort of this fight or flight. And so because of that, in new situations, I'm trying to figure out, I don't know you, can I trust you, right? So do we need to fight or do I need to get out of here? And so typically, and Paul probably knows this, he's done a lot of sales, right? We're trying to attack those objections. But what someone's looking for is the gotcha moment, which basically validates their beliefs that you're a fraud or you're trying to take advantage of them. So what tends to be really effective is the allegiance capital sort of thing, which is, hey, my biases are these things, and here's why you're going to think that I'm wrong. Or when you hear me tell you this, here's why you're going to think it's total BS. So I'm going to acknowledge that up front. You're probably going to, or other people have. And it's attacking the gotcha moments where, again, they're looking for a reason why they need to fight or flight. Right? So just trying to put some additional language to the power of being very, very explicit about your bias or assumptions, and then also taking it a step further and then calling out why they're going to think what you're going to tell them is wrong. Nick does a really good job with that. Anybody else want to reflect or have anything they want to share around this idea of explicitly understanding your assumptions? Ben.
He talks about an hostage negotiation where he brings up the thing in advance that's like the elephant kind of thing. Yeah, he's saying, you probably think I'm a bad guy, or you must be thinking that I'm trying to screw you over and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I think his language is leading with empathy. You can correct me if I'm wrong because you've had more conversations with Chris. But there is a sense of leading with empathy when you recognize what they probably think is BS or how they're probably feeling in that situation. And by front-loading it with saying your bias or my assumption is that you've been kind of vulnerable, so you've given them some permission to also be vulnerable. Like, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Or, you know what? That wasn't what I was thinking. Here's what I'm actually thinking. Great. That's a valuable piece of information for you to correct me. Now I understand better where you're coming from. You've also given me some more data that makes it a little bit easier to sort of influence the direction of the conversation. So yeah, that was a really good addition, Ben. Anybody else? Okay, so that was some prefacing. And then also, I just want to remind folks about this notion that every system is perfectly designed to get the results you're getting or the outcome it's currently generating. And so what does that mean? What is the takeaway from the idea that every system is perfectly designed to get the results you're getting? Anybody want to offer what they think I'm going to say next? So if you don't like the results that you're getting, what are the options that you have? You either change the inputs or you change the system. Right? Those are really the two options.
Or complain.
Or complain. Third option. So in some situations, I guess to ask a question, can we always change the system? No. Like taxes, law, most of the taxes, regulations, so on and so forth. Maybe we can influence them, but that's a very, very long-term horizon, right? If I want to change the tax code, that might take me 20, 30 years to build up enough influence, so on and so forth, right? So oftentimes, we can't change the system, and so what do we end up doing as humans? We spend a bunch of time complaining, to Nick's point, but we can't change the system. Complaining doesn't necessarily get us a different outcome. So what do we need to do if we can't change the system? We need to understand how the system works so that we can modify our behavior, change the inputs, so that now, using the system the way that it is, we're going to get the outcome that we want, or at least closer to the outcome that we want. I used to use the language rigging the game, but the essence of what a lot of wealthy folks do is they rig the game to win because they understand the system so explicitly that they understand how to modify their behavior to get the outcome that they want. So they are rigging the game, right? They didn't change the system. They changed their inputs. And then there's a longer term game, right? If you choose to take that on, lots of resources to actually change the system itself. So the context of certainty, did you have something you want to add on to that? Yeah.
So this kind of shows up for me quite a bit. It's one of the reasons I'm in a partnership. So I am constantly like second guessing, not necessarily second guessing, but like going back to, am I doing all or nothing thinking, or am I actually changing the input? Right? Because the system, obviously our system was entirely flawed, and it was just better for everything to go. So I'm trying to like figure out like if I am putting myself through this type of a thinking where it's like, okay, change the system, change the input, or if I'm actually going to be, I'm just going to blow everything up, right? Am I making sense? So how do we kind of...
So you have a partnership or partnerships that aren't getting you the outcome that you want, and as it stands currently, they're unwilling to modify their behavior?
Yes.
And how do you know that they're unwilling to modify their behavior? Because you've asked them.
We've had many conversations and that.
Many conversations.
We've made the decision to just go ahead and
Nick, do you want to offer up some thoughts first? I have some reactions, but.
So I just question if it's me just going out and saying like, hey, like, I'm just all or nothing being rude, or going to do it this way, and in fact, we're going to act. Or I'm actually looking at it from from this side of
Well, partnerships are a little bit different. I mean, everything's a little bit more complicated than we want it to be. So I'll start back, like, this is the text or law or whatever. It's a good example where people get stuck on the technical, right? They're like picketing out, say, change the law, change that. They're doing nothing to change their own behavior. Like, they're not taking the adaptive approach. We're saying, this is the system. I can't change it. I'm going to change my own behavior. Instead, let's vote for somebody that's going to change the law, right? So there's a complete refusal to look at your own behavior, which is a problem. But in a partnership, you have like the technical aspect. This is how our partnership works on paper. And then you have two sets of behaviors that need to get modified, one in which you have no control over, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I tend to think that if you have there's a lot of nuance here. If you have a bunch of conversations and it's very clear this person is not going to modify their behavior, then I would personally say, yeah, that's something that, because at the end of the day, you cannot control the outcome. There's a system and there's your behavior, right? This can be set in stone and this can be modified inputs, but then you have this other set of behaviors that you just have no control over. It's not to say a partnership can't work. We have a partnership. It works great. But if the other person is unwilling, then I tend to lean towards, so my bias, see what I did there? My bias is reliability, right? System reliability. And so if there's a history of another party that is not reliably modifying their behavior, I just can't. It is violating my own personal economic principles by saying, right, system reliability is a thing. Upside is a thing, all this stuff. But as long as it is reliable, meaning we get the outcome that we expect to get most of the time, I can modify things and isolate variables and get what I want. So if there's an unwilling party, to me, it just doesn't fit in my world, if that makes sense. And it's not all or nothing thinking. If it is in my opinion, and Dan might feel differently, it's not all or nothing thinking if it's a predetermined, like on bumpers, like a predetermined non-negotiable. I sat down when I was sober, clear-minded, and said, I cannot have a partner, especially like a 50-50 partner, or that cannot modify their behavior reliably or cannot follow through on what we talk about. I don't consider all or nothing thinking to have a non-negotiable that was decided on in a moment of sobriety, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think more of my question would be that how is it that we can kind of do an internal check to see if we are in that or not?
Good question.
Yeah. So a few different ways that I would approach this question. I think the first is to understand. So we got to compile, analyze, strategize, execute. So if you've compiled, inherently, you're sort of moving out of the all or nothing thinking because you're looking for all of the data, right? Now, at some point later when you strategize or execute, you might flip back to, I just want to be done with this, right? That's a very all or nothing. Like, screw this person, I'm done. That's a very, I'm in or I'm out. Okay, so I tend to follow like a very linear process for trying to examine these types of issues. So step one would be trying to figure out what are the resources that I'm using to maintain this partnership. So how much time, energy, influence, et cetera, does it take to maintain this partnership? So I understand that first. Then I want to understand where is it on the barbell, which we're going to talk about later. Is it reliable, consistent income, or is it sort of my exploit, or is it my long-term play? Right. So is it reliable, consistent, or is it long-term? Okay. If it's reliable, consistent, pay all my bills, and it takes a lot of my resources, then I'm violating my own principles because I'm putting in too many resources into something that's inherently not asymmetric, right? So I'm putting in all the resources, and so there's these trade-offs. I'm not able to actually have enough resources to invest in something that has a lot of upside, right? Then the question becomes investor frame. Based off what I know today, would I opt back into this relationship? Right now I'm saying no. Am I able to get the resources that it requires me right now down to a level that I could continue doing this? So I'll just take like my CPA firm business as an example, right? It's a reliable, consistent business. It's not a 10x business. It's not going to cash me out overnight. But it's consistent and it will fund all my priorities. But if it takes all of my resources, then I have nothing left to invest in things that are going to cash me out in a much shorter term horizon, right? Fund all of my goals. So for me to continue operating it, I have to reduce the resources that it takes to a point that I freed up, reallocated the resources to those asymmetric things. So all that to say, you filter through all of it and you go, based off what I know, can I turn this partnership into something that doesn't require a lot of effort and it's going to fit properly in the different sides of the barbell? If the answer is no, then why would you not sell it? Right? Because the decision to not sell and to stay in that relationship is guaranteeing that you won't have the resources to create the opportunities that are going to give you the life that you want. Right? Does that make sense? I just filtered through like a bunch of different principles without being very explicit about each one and tried to shortcut that. But does that make sense? So I don't think that's all or nothing thinking. If you systematically work through resource allocation, where does it fit on my barbell? Can I get the resources down to a level that makes this investment still make sense? Right? Because a 50-50 partnership that's kicking off income to you and you don't have to spend any time, energy, et cetera in, yeah, keep doing that. Why wouldn't I do that, right? If I'm just getting a check and I'm not taking a bunch of resources, yeah. If I'm getting a check, but it takes up all my time and I don't enjoy the other person, how do I get out of that? Right? And get out of it is selling it, or getting out of it is getting it to a level where your investment of time is sufficient.
So I'll run you through really quick. Just
Blake might have had something.
The
Okay,
all or
sorry.
nothing, the all or nothing orientation. It's dogmatic. We talked about this in Nick's Miss in July a little bit. So if we run through what is a dogmatic orientation, it is being haphazard in the process, which it sounds like you've been diligent about, so that's good. And you're trying to decide, am I going to maintain a partnership or not? That's dogmatic. You got one or two predetermined outcomes that are acceptable. So if you're falling into that realm, you might be a little bit all or nothing thinking because there are infinite number of different ways that partnership could work or play out. You could explore all those and you might end up in a partnership or not. Right? But it might be, like Dan said, maybe you take a little bit less of a percent and it takes a lot of weight off your shoulders. Have you considered that? So if you're thinking, I'm either ending this or I'm staying in it as it is, then it's all or nothing thinking. Right? And so the scientific orientation or the adaptive orientation is there's an infinite number of potential outcomes and a whole bunch of them I'd be okay with. So that's really if you're approaching it that way and you're looking at range of different ways to work it out or end it, then you're not being dogmatic. You know, then the question is like, have you actually explored all the options and stuff like that? But that's the trick is, when you really say, but do I understand there's an infinite number of ways this could look?
Well, then you can kind of get into a realm of like analysis paralysis, right?
Mhm.
You can go in, there can be 1,000 different options, and how far down that rabbit hole you go.
Soft offense. You go through the process. So a scientific process is I have a theory, right? And then I actually do the experiment, and then I see what happens, and it is what it is. It's either acceptable or it's not to you, right? So it's I don't think it's so much as like, here's all the options, pick one. I think it's what is the process I'm going to go through to let this reveal itself, and then when it reveals itself, does it fit on the barbell? Does it make sense to me? Right, so it will reveal itself if you just push on it enough. You have this conversation. What is the range? You could say, hey, what's the range you're acceptable with? If you've partnered with me and Dan recently, you know how this goes, right? We say, what's the range? And if they come back and go, you know, we think we can give you guys like 3%. Yeah, let's just end this conversation because that's so far out of range that we're going to insult each other if we continue this, right? But there's a range in which we can continue to have the conversation. So there's an infinite number of ways it could work out. If you're coming from that place, you're not all or nothing. But then it's, again, the dogmatic one is saying, all right, we got to try to make this work. Where ideally, it would be like, all right, let's sit down, let's talk, let's go through this process and see what reveals itself. And if you're clear on your barbell, if you're clear on your needs, your solvable problem, your economic principles, what reveals itself will either fit or it won't. Does that make sense? So it's just more, for me, it's more of a process orientation. But first, we have to decide, what does our barbell look like currently? What is our solvable problem? Else, we won't know if that's acceptable when it reveals itself.
So you've had these conversations. Have any of those conversations been around, are you willing to restructure roles and responsibilities and ownership percentage?
Yeah, so after the last summit, we did the deciding we did a deep talk on this slash these are my non-negotiables. We have a conversation.
Okay, yeah.
And that was,
So then, that's sort of, you took a micro step, right? You could have come up with an infinite number of scenarios of how
well,
to shape
I
it.
had like 500 in my head, but
So you had 500. We could have come up with theoretically an infinite number, right? But to Nick's point earlier, it's a relationship. So you go, but the first step, micro step, hey, would you even be willing to entertain changing the shape of our partnership? And I've got these non-negotiables. He said no. So then you don't really have any other options, right? Okay, if that's a no, and I have these list of non-negotiables, then inherently we have to dissolve.
Yeah. So he is being
So
dogmatic.
he's the one who's being all or nothing, right? You're not, based off what you've shared thus far. So yeah, you could have a number of solves for this problem, but if the other party isn't willing to even hear them, then you're left with no other option but to move on, right? Which might be unfortunate, but this is where we have to go back and gut check and go, okay, now am I trying to rescue this other person? I'm trying to convince them. Don't they see how smart I am and all these solutions? Like, we could solve this and both of us could make a shit ton of money if we could just work together on this. But that's not about you. They're not even willing to have the conversation. So to Nick's point on when we have had partnership, the conversation, we float it, clearly non-negotiable, not worth putting any more resources into it. Now the other party can come back and go, hey, you know what, I rethought this, not 3%, some other number. Or he could come back, but it's a game of trying to find the right descriptor. It's trying to convince him to modify his behavior is only going to lead to more suffering for you.
Are you open, I know the answer, but just thought exercise. Are you open to a numerous number, 500, 600, 1,000 different ways that you would be willing to work? Yeah. Okay, so you're not being all or nothing. You have 1,000 options you'd be acceptable with, not 2.
Yeah.
throw a wrench into this. But,
Sure. Okay.
so, Nick was talking about that person that's unwilling, like, he's unwilling, right? What if he's willing but incompetent? Like, how do you navigate that? Or does the inputs of the system change at all?
Well, I can't have an incompetent partner.
That's a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
So, yeah, good question. But if at some point they reveal themselves to be incompetent, like I'll often put in, just as an extreme in an operating agreement, like if you steal, like you lose from the partnership, you lose your entire ownership percentage. Right? And
If
so-
it turns out you're not very smart, it's in the contract. If I decide you're not very smart, you're out.
That's making it an extreme, but there is an example of a non-negotiable. But yeah, incompetence, then you'd have to rescue, and then we're back to trying to rescue them. Now I have to help you become competent. The amount of resources I'm going to have to allocate for that, that's not a problem that I'm willing to solve.
So you've all heard me say this before, and I'll just repeat it because I think it's malice and incompetence look identical. Yeah. So if you wouldn't have a malicious partner, you can't have the intent is different, but it's going to manifest the same as if they were malicious if they are incompetent, because they manifest the same.
Yeah. Never attribute to malice what could otherwise be explained as incompetence.
Yep.
Is the quote.
Yep. So if you wouldn't have a malicious partner, which I don't think anybody here, then you can't have an incompetent one. And it's unfortunate when you know the intent is not malicious, but the outcome still is negative or detrimental. And those are, Paul has a book right there that I recommend everybody read called Crucial Conversations. Those are crucial conversations to have.
It's good.
They talk about establishing mutual purpose, and if you don't have that in the beginning, you don't establish what are we trying to accomplish here? Even if it's just, can we just have a respectful conversation? If not,
Well, that was the thing, we did have those conversations,
yeah.
but it was not, I mean, we could go down the topic.
Sure.
But yeah, we did have those conversations, and he changed his behavior to not be in line with what we discussed.
But based on, just to put a bow on it, based on what you have shared, I do not believe that you are displaying all or nothing thinking.
And I really liked your comment of, am I willing to accept and that for me is like a check. Am I willing to accept any one of the 5 or 6 different options rather than just yes or no? Right, so that for me is like a check for myself. Am I willing to accept any one option?
There is in a scientific orientation, adaptive orientation, there's an infinite number of potential options, many of which I would accept. That's where you want to check yourself is, am I in that place where there's a lot of ways this could work out, and there's a whole bunch of them that I would probably be totally okay with.
Cool. All right. So we're sort of talking about system, and the system that we preach around certainty is changing our orientation. And some of you are like, okay, I've heard this over and over and over again, a visceral reaction. And that's intentional to some degree. Least amount of effort, least amount of risk, most amount of options to achieve certainty, which is funding what we want. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But so we can play our game, meaning we don't have to become someone that we're not. Right? And oftentimes you might be in a partnership where the other person wants to put in the most amount of effort and take on the most amount of risk, and you're left with no options, and that's just a non-negotiable, right? Or they're asking you to compromise and become someone that you're not. And so again, these would become non-negotiables for me in a partnership for sure. And so certainty is a way that we define it, is funding what we want on our timeline, again, without compromising who we are. So we're going to play our game. And so then we have to get really clear on what it is that we want, and we have to get clear on our timeline, and we also have to get clear on who we are, what is playing our game. And a lot of CCA is about trying to unwind the patterns and behaviors that we already have. We've heard over and over from internet marketers and business textbooks about becoming some entirely different person, and these hyperbolic statements that are out there that suggest that there's only one way of doing it, and there's a mountain of evidence to suggest that that's not even true, right? So most of this is simple, but it's not easy. It's not easy to opt into or find pathways that are the least amount of effort, the least amount of risk, and give you the most amount of options. You're like, yeah, I get it. Okay, but it's not simple. Now, the system requires a set of assumptions. In the system, what are we optimizing towards? In this case, we call them commandments because I don't want to violate. I'm okay violating an assumption, but I probably don't want to violate a commandment. And so, refresher for some, everyone's probably heard these, even those that are in CCA 3, probably heard various forms of these, and we've talked about some of them in rapid fire in the conversation today already. But commandment number 1, and these are all interrelated, we must bias closer over more. And so that implies, so every action we take needs to get us closer to what we want. And so that implies that we actually have clarity on what it is that we want. Now the thing is that it's an infinite game. So this is the other challenge with partnerships, is that your partnership 2 years ago you might have been entirely aligned. You wanted the same thing. And then you changed, you got new information, they changed. And now what you individually want no longer works. So can you find a way to come together and make it work? And if not, how do we move on without it being totally destructive? So we're going to bias closer. Is this action getting me closer to what I want? Okay. Number 2 is we have to delineate between preference and binary. Preference is unique to you. Binary is there's a 0 and a 1. There's a right or wrong. And so what I found is that most of the discussions that I have are discussions that are preference-based. You know, how do we load the dishwasher? Well, some of us might think that there's an exact science to doing that, and then, but yet we can't agree or align with our partner or our family on how to load the dishwasher. Like, we have preferences, and so it's really important that we're clear in the moment. We have sobriety around, is this a preference or is this right or wrong? Because if it's right or wrong, I just go to Google and get the answer, right? Because it's facts. But if it's a preference, I can't go to Google. That means that ultimately I can go out and I can find resources, but at the end of the day, it's what do I want? Right? What do I want? And we have to have the confidence to assert that. So, and to this conversation about the partnership, what you want is true. What they want is true. Right? You don't have to align. You don't have to agree. And so nobody's in the wrong. Sometimes these separations turn very toxic because both parties are approaching it like there's a right or wrong. Like, both of us are actually right in this moment. And so that's the tension. Now, at the end of the day, we have to move on. Both of us don't necessarily agree with that. But when we have a discrepancy in preferences, sometimes that's the only option. Then every decision has an infinite number of trade-offs. When we make one decision, we remove an infinite number of other possibilities. So again, just leveraging this conversation we just had about partnerships, there's an infinite number of ways to structure a partnership. It may not feel like that, but conceptually there is. When I decide to invest my time in coming out here and hanging out with us for today, there's conceptually an infinite number of other things that you could have been doing. So just understanding that, those trade-offs. When I invest and it's not just money, right? We tend to get really fixated on money as the primary currency, but there's time and there's influence and there's energy and there's relationships. It's not just money. So understanding that trade-off that you're making. Right? And then lastly, our criteria, our commandment is all bets must be asymmetric to the upside. And that concept is resources are scarce, right? Again, time is scarce, we know that. Money is scarce, we know that. Our energy is scarce. And so if I'm going to take these scarce resources and invest them in something, it's a bet. I think about business as a game. I also think about business as gambling. I think about investing as gambling. And we know that the house wins more than it doesn't, right? Because we'll make these statements like, I fail more than I don't, right? We make those statements. We know that. We know we fail more often than we. So that's similar to the house. The house wins more than it doesn't. So given that, I need to make sure that I'm only making bets where there's significantly more upside than downside. And so we can get there, previous conversations today, we can get there by trying to eliminate the downside altogether. Right? So if I can eliminate all the downside, I'm only left with upside. So for those of you in CCA3, we're going to spend the next 3 or 4 weeks talking about each of these commandments in more detail, and specifically how, when we violate one of these commandments, the consequence is that we end up taking on more effort, more risk, and or have less optionality. So the consequence of violating these is violating the orientation that we're aimed towards, or that we've re-aimed ourselves to. We're also going to talk about reasons why, even though this is simple, we're not going to want to do it. We're going to want to violate. We're going to tend to still want to bias more over closer. We're going to tend to get stuck in these arguments like there's a right or wrong when it's just a preference. We're going to tend to treat things like they're all or nothing and not recognize that there's an infinite number of trade-offs. And then because of FOMO or other biases, we're going to tend to make bets that aren't actually asymmetric to the upside. Often we'll make bets where it's asymmetric to the downside, where there's the potential win around the corner isn't nearly as big as the potential loss, which is back to that whole burn the boats. Right? The actual scenario, burn the boats, was asymmetric to the upside because they knew that if they went home, they were certain of death, but they weren't certain of death if they went into battle. Right? So that wasn't actually an asymmetric scenario, arguably, but the way that it exists in business context is typically asymmetric to the downside. I go all in, take all my resources, and if I lose, I end up homeless. Like, okay, well that's asymmetric, but arguably to the downside, right? So we need to think through those, and we have to recognize the tendency to violate these commandments and why we won't do them. So for those of you in CCA3, we're going to spend the next 3 or 4 weeks kind of deconstructing this in more detail, and then that's what leads into the tools for how we process these issues. Right? But we like to start these conferences with just reminding people what is our orientation, and then what are we really trying to accomplish, so that we have a shared language. Because I can say to Nick, or he'll say to me, damn, this is a preference-based conversation. End of conversation. I'm no longer arguing. Yeah, you're right. That is a preference-based decision. Or I say, you know what? My preference is this is a binary decision, and I happen to be right. But you know that doesn't tend to be super effective. But or he can call me out and say, hey, you're getting really stuck in all or nothing thinking. Have you thought about these 500 other possible outcomes? No, I haven't. Or, you know what, I don't see the asymmetry to the upside. Can we reason through this? And how can we eliminate the downside? So it's these quick kind of things that you can kind of snap yourself out of it. Because we talk about closing the gap. Have you guys heard us talk about closing the gap? And usually we think about that immediately in terms of money. But the biggest win, I think, for people in CCA in terms of closing the gap is just being able to snap out of the spiraling faster and go, okay, yeah, I'm fighting with someone and this conversation is going nowhere because it's a preference. Right? So what would have taken me 3 weeks, 6 weeks, I might have spun out. I mean, there's things that I've spun out on for months before. Right? And now, if I can go from being spun out for 90 days to being spun out for 2 weeks, it still sucks that I was spun out for 2 weeks, but that net benefit is significant. What was that cost of that additional 10 weeks or 11 weeks of being spun out? Right? So closing the gap can be money, right? Getting there faster. If we're betting on things that are highly asymmetric, we probably do. But the bigger benefit is how can I just get clarity faster and not stay in this space that doesn't actually serve me. Nick, anything you want to add on to that?
Let me make sure my mic's on. I think you nailed it. I also just want to, everything Dan just said, just pretend like I said it. And then just understand too that there's power in. We'll have 4 cohorts at the end of the year. They'll start by the end of the year, cohort 4, which means there's a handful of people now that are going to share a language that you can tap into. Like Dan and I share an office, so it's really easy. But you could teach your spouse, your business partner, but also this community. You can just drop into the community chat, or you guys do Zoom calls, and prevent each other from spinning out, save each other a lot of time. And what that does is that makes everything it gives it more asymmetry to the upside. If every conversation you have was likely to, on average, spin you out for 2 weeks, and you develop a toolkit that now you just lose 2 days of being spazzed out, you've actually mitigated some of the downside of just everyday things that you have to do, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay. So tap into to help the people around you, the crucial conversations. Read the frickin' book. Have these conversations with people around you, help them understand how they can help you and how it will help them, and tap into the people in this room, because they can do the same thing for you, where they go, I think that's a preference-based thing. Okay. You don't have to like it, but at least you can accept it and move on with your life instead of losing 6 weeks. Because that's a very valuable. There's a thing that to tie this in with those that know Dr. Jeff and have worked with Dr. Jeff, and Ron Lynch told me this the other day, that there's maybe 5 or 6 days of the year during the year that actually creates this quantum leap forward. You guys ever notice that there's 2 or 3 days where you're just on and you just happen to have the right conversation, and there's 5 or 6 days, maybe less, a year on average, where all the stars align and you have an opportunity to go exponential. And if you are spinning out during that time because you don't have a toolbox to clarify your mind, you're gonna miss it. You only get 5 or 6 opportunities. And most of us miss them. We had a nice long talk about Tom. It's a version we talked about, because you're so in your head and trying to figure out how everything works that you miss these 5 or 6 days. So it domesticates some of the downside, actually creates upside, just by having a toolbox to get your mind clear and not get stuck in these doom loops.
Yeah. Brandon.
So one of the things that is where I tie this in, it helps me remember this, how quickly you go from upset to reset. How much time is in between that you just waste and you maybe miss those 5 or 6 days.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, so the thing that I say ad nauseum, again, the CCA2 has heard me say, and those of you in cohort 3 will hear me say, is that the intention of the program is not for you to approach it like a rote memorization exercise, where you're I got to get these 4 down. I have to be able to articulate them in the same exact words. That's not the point of the program or the operating system. The point is for you to take the information, ingest it, and then make it your own, right? So I didn't set out to have 4 commandments. I didn't set out to have 12 principles. That's just where things have ended up, right? So you take these, you ingest it, you make it your own, right? So you might end up with 3, you might end up with 6, you might change the language slightly, but the ultimate outcome is to have a system to begin with, because absent a consistent system to go back to, you end up in it takes me 90 days to recover when I'm spinning out, because I don't even have a toolkit to go back to, right? So make it your own, adjust it accordingly, and then to Nick's point, having a community of people that you can go back to help you process the issues. The tendency is to want to take this to people who do not have the receptivity to even hear it to begin with, and then we're trying to convince them of why they should follow this. Now, what step in the process is consensus? I'm looking at Ben. Consensus is the last step in the process. Now, how do we typically treat consensus? We typically treat it as the first step in the process, and a lot of conventional management techniques and approaches are around this idea of getting everybody on board. Right? But then you lose all momentum in the process of trying to get everybody on board when you don't even have enough data to begin with to know if your ideas make sense. So you try to get everybody on board, you get them on board, you find out that it was a bad idea, so then you got the new idea, and then they've lost trust in you because you keep changing. There's always these changes. Right? Until we have enough data and we know what we're doing works and makes sense, we're not trying to get people on board. We're going to get them on board once we know it works to begin with. Right? So you can spend a lot of energy trying to convince everybody, you got to bias asymmetry. Come on, closer over more. Right? And they may not be ready to even hear that. And you've got to ingest it and make it your language so that when you share it, you have the anecdotes. You can tell the stories in a way that increases the probability that they can hear it. Like if you're just trying to parrot back something you've heard, chances are they're not going to be that inspired by it. Right? So ingest it, make it your own. And I'll just keep saying that over and over and over again, because there's a tendency in any sort of formal education thing to approach it like I just need to memorize it. So at that point, or at this point, unless anybody has any questions, or Nick, you have any comments, we're going to pause. Lunch should be out in a few minutes. We'll hang out till probably 1 o'clock, and then we'll get started back on what we have for the rest of today, unless Nick has something to add. But he's already sat down, I feel like.
I'm speaking from here now.
Okay, all right.
No, I have nothing to add. We're gonna do lunch and then we're gonna come back, and I do recommend that in case I forget to tell you when we start, I would probably have a pen and paper or something to write or draw on. People tend to want to draw this out when it's taught.
All right, so for those of you guys who have been wondering about Randy, I just got a text from his son Marshall, and he says, good news from the neurologist today. Barring any major setbacks, he believes Randy will make a full recovery and be able to travel and drive again by September. And then seconds after that, I got a text from Randy. I want to call in today. So our guy's coming back, and maybe we'll get him on for a minute, because he terribly misses everyone and would love to. I had to talk him out of coming today. So
we're going to have to change the end time to like 6:30.
6:30, yeah. Move out your flights. All right, Nick.
Yeah. What?
You're up. Barbell.
All right. Do we have most of the people here? Just the important ones? Okay, the barbell. So how many are familiar with the barbell? Have heard me talk about the barbell? Can maybe kind of conceptualize what I mean when I say the barbell? All right. So we were talking at lunch, and this theme came up. And I want to share this, because you're going to see a lot of things over the weeks, months, years that fall on this kind of framework. So at the highest level, when you go to the people that really know their shit, they really, like a true expert, what you find is the same things over and over and over and over again. Conceptually, they use different language, but you see the same things. Okay? And so the barbell represents itself, and we'll try to get a graphic up, and I'll walk you guys through it, in risk and probability in finance and investing. It shows up as reliable upside, or more risk reward, less risk reward, reliability upside. In medicine, it shows up as MRV MED, maximal recoverable volume, minimum effective dose. In computer science, it'll show up as explore exploit. How does a computer know what to do at this time? Right? It's a barbell. It's a bimodal strategy where we either explore or exploit, and you don't do anything in the middle, and I'll explain why. So this was first introduced to me by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It was introduced to him, or he found it, Seneca. That's how old it is. This is Seneca's bimodal risk mitigation strategy. This is how we mitigate risk and maintain upside. So a lot of people think there's a trade-off, there's a little bit of a trade-off, but you think if I get rid of risk, I also get rid of upside. If I want upside, I have to take risk. There's some truth to that, maybe in isolation, but in totality, you can actually build a world, your world, where the risk has been mitigated and you've maintained the upside. Does that make sense up to this point? Okay, so it's a bimodal risk mitigation strategy. It looks like that, so we call it the barbell. Really simple way to think about it. So when I first taught this to the network years ago, people just started, every decision they made, they started drawing barbells and trying to figure out where it fits. It's actually a decent exercise to go through. So the concept here is we have this barbell, okay? And there are a few reasons we start something new. If we go to Maslow's hierarchy, let's assume the physiological needs are met, because sometimes you start something because you got to pay your bills and like eat food. We're going to assume that that's already handled, so that's me telling you what my assumption is. When you got to figure out how to eat food and feed your family tonight, you do whatever you got to do to eat food and feed your family tonight. So, assuming that mundane is handled, why do we start a business? Why do we invest in crypto? Why do we invest in real estate? Why do we have a side hustle? Right? Because we believe it represents an upside we don't already have. Can we agree on that basic? We think, right, you got a business and you're like, oh, well, if I do this other business, I'll have more upside. Otherwise, why would you do it? So you could have another job, right? We don't think about building another job. So we have upside. Now, on the flip side, we also have reliability. Okay, reliability is a really important word. I just want to spend a little bit of time on reliability. That means, so when people see reliable and upside, sometimes their brain thinks active and passive, and that is not the case. Does that make sense? A lot of times people think like, well, my job and my investments. And they may fall on the barbell that way, but sometimes our brain thinks active, passive, because active does not mean reliable. Reliability, the way that I talk about it, we talk about it in the Wolf Den, NCCA, reliability is the probability or the percentage of time we get the outcome that we expect. So if you work in your business all day long and you expect to work 5 hours a day and make 30 grand a month, and not a single day did you actually work 5 hours and you don't make 30 grand a month, it is not reliable. Just to make that distinction. Does that make sense? Because we need to have reliability is about having some idea of input output, right? So a lot of times we have a business that we think is reliable. It's on this side of the barbell. I'm going to tell you in a minute why it's typically not. And we start a new business. We have our same business with a new offer. I'm going to use business as an example because it's easy. And what happens, and we think it's going to have all this upside, okay? The other thing about upside is it's unknown. It is also unknown. So you might believe you just bought this Amazon store and it's going to be reliable, but until you have the data, it is unknown. Okay? So it's more risk, potentially higher reward, unknown. All right? So when we start something new, it is inherently on this side of the barbell. If nothing else, because it's unknown. Now, when we first start our business, we're thinking like, we're going to be billionaires. We're going to have all this impact. We're going to make millions and millions of dollars. We start a business because of the upside. It doesn't have to be financial. It could be identity. It could be whatever, reputation, impact. But the upside represents something important to you, and it is nearly unlimited. Or it's so high that you think it's worth starting. Because starting something's fucking hard. So you don't do it unless in your head there's this huge upside, right? So we start a business with two potential outcomes that typically we want. either it's a home run and we're going to have a huge exit really quickly, or it's going to be a passive source of income, right? I'm going to turn my business into I'm going to work on my business, not in my business. It's going to be this passive thing. Or it's at least going to be reliable, meaning I know I'm going to spend 20 hours a week, I'm going to make this much. That's what we think. Does that ever actually happen? No. So what happens is we end up with a business that no longer has the upside, right? Dan has been through this with like the accounting firm. We all go through, like for some reason, it doesn't have the upside we thought it would have, right? It's too much work. It's really hard to hire people for all these reasons that we didn't maybe account for. Or maybe it was never supposed to have explosive upside. It was just going to be a reliable asset. So it's not an asset with unlimited upside. CCA is not an unlimited upside play. We have relationships with all of you. We cannot possibly have a relationship business like Dan talks about and also infinite upside. So it's not an upside play. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's not upside. Well, then we just make it reliable. It's cool. It just goes on autopilot and pays our bills. But because we don't fully understand the barbell, we don't fully understand reliability, and sometimes don't have the skill set to do it, we end up, it doesn't have the upside, nor is it reliable. If your business does not have unlimited upside and it's not reliable, do you know what it is? It's a job. You made yourself a job, which is okay, but you made yourself a job. So what do? We launch another business. You know what happens? Now you have 2 jobs. Then sometimes another one, and then you have 3 jobs. There's no unlimited upside, there's no reliability. Now you can't take a freaking vacation because the reliability is not there. You can't walk away from your business. You have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. There's no reliability. There's no upside. So now we are in the riskiest position possible. Right? Least amount of risk, least amount of effort, most amount of options. We've done the exact opposite. We have a shit ton of risks. So we have 3, in this scenario, we have 3 jobs that we have to maintain. Otherwise, 1, we won't make money. 2, reputational risk, et cetera, et cetera. We have very little options because we have to work 80 hours a week to keep our 3 jobs, and a tremendous amount of risk. Biggest risk being there is no path to funding your solvable problem. When you have 3 jobs and you need to make $20 million next amount of, given what you know, there's no clear path to actually funding your solvable problem, right? Does all that make sense? So when we play on a barbell, we need one side that is reliable, and we're always working to make it more reliable, and then one side that has significant asymmetry to the upside. It may be less reliable, which is why, well, it will be less reliable, which is why we need to have a reliable side to pay our bills, cover our expenses, et cetera, put away some savings if that's what you want to do, et cetera, et cetera. Make sense? Okay. So that is the high level, that's what a bimodal strategy looks like. What's happening is if you think about it and you're patient and you work the process, in theory, you could have a reliable path that funds your core priorities, or whatever language we want to use. I'll let Dan chime in on that later. And then put all additional resources into upside, something that could be the equivalent of a lottery ticket. Could be cryptocurrency, could be a startup company, could be a home run play. You might want to build a SaaS technology. The point is, we want to keep this barbell balanced, and I think balance is going to look different for everybody. In the certainty methodology, and what we're hoping that people figure out in the Wolf Den is when we go to the certainty app and we fill out the solvable problem, we want as much as possible to fund it with our reliable income, right? I'm here and I want to be here in this amount of time, and we want this to get us on track. That stuff might make it happen next year. Okay, but we can't have we can't have everything that we have exposed to this infinite upside because we have no reliability. And then you make a whole bunch of really stupid decisions. So that makes sense so far? Okay. So what you'll look at is oftentimes, and I'll just go through this part real quick, if you actually draw out a barbell, you can start with your business, you can think about your investments, whatever. If you actually draw out a barbell and you're really honest with yourself, most things you're doing are sitting over here. Some of them are sitting over here. Most of them are sitting right here. Right in the middle. Okay? So then we have this conversation about where does it belong? How do I move it over? Do I need to get rid of it? If you have a business that's in the middle of the barbell here, and we say, cool, could that be an upside? Like, no, there's no upside in that. There's no upside in this business, which is really hard for us to admit to ourselves. But it's not a negative thing. Like I said, CCA is not an infinite upside. Nth degree is not an infinite upside business. It's a relationship business. There's no infinite 10x overnight when you actually have to talk to people and know them, meet them, etc. So it's a reliable thing. What happens is most of the things will be in the middle. And the question is, do I know how to make it reliable? And am I willing to do what I would have to do to make it reliable? If not, it's kind of an investor frame exercise. If not, you might have to get rid of it. Right? Because we want as often as possible to work this barbell. Again, what it does if we are intentional about it, the biggest risk, when I say domesticate risk, first of all, you cannot completely eliminate risk. There are things outside of our control, like you could live in a freaking bubble and then get hit by a meteor, like we can't eliminate all risks. What we want to do is domesticate it. So that's step one. How can we just get control of the risk that we're taking and understand it and have a little bit of, are there lead indicators? Do we know when the risk is going up? Do we know how to take risk off the table when appropriate? So that's just, in my language, it's just domesticating the risk. It's like training it, like having a little bit of control over it. So we want to domesticate risk. The biggest risk, this is really, really important, in my opinion, for understanding the barbell. The biggest risk any of us take is not getting what we want out of life. So there's one way to guarantee you don't get what you want out of life. Don't define it. Okay? So think in this is, we have to be very, very careful about closer versus more. If the biggest risk is not getting what we want out of life, then being too heavy on the upside at the expense of locking in what you want is risky. So the way we would drive down risk is, again, to try to get this on track to fund what we want so that we lock in what we want. Does that make sense? We can still keep the upside if additional resources go over there. Okay? So crypto is a good example. Startup VC funds are a great example. I have a partner, Tim, and I think he's probably, got like 41K1s. He just invests in companies. And it's like, hey, how much money do you make off those? I don't know. Maybe never. Just waiting for a liquidation event. Now, since I've known him, he's had 2 huge liquidation events. So 2 of those plays have made him like a ridiculous amount of money. Okay, but what's important is that the mindset was these plays you shouldn't have to actively manage. It should be like you put it over there and you just kind of forget about it. That makes sense? Otherwise, you're starting to get close to a job. A lot of people have turned crypto into a job. Like investing in crypto. Building projects and stuff, it's different. But anything that you turn into a job, you're getting further away from honoring your barbell. Okay? All that make sense? Any questions? Real quick. Yeah. Is there what?
Waste, wasted energy, wasted resources.
Yeah, mostly. I mean, there could be a lot of things, but the biggest waste is your bandwidth because it's not reliable. You wake up in the morning, for an example, and you have no idea what the hell, how many hours you're gonna have to work today. Are you gonna be able to take a lunch today? Are you gonna have to stay at the office late? Can you pick your kids up from school? Because it's not reliable, and it's consistently unreliable. So there's a huge waste there in bandwidth. Are you gonna get paid? Are you gonna collect, you're supposed to collect X amount of receivables today. Are you going to do it? Because you don't reliably collect the amount you're supposed to collect. So there's a huge waste in bandwidth.
I was just going to go back to that commandment about an infinite number of trade-offs. So the decision to allocate resources to a job or a business that's stuck in the middle is that it's taking up the resources that could have gone to either establishing a consistent source of income, this side, or could have gone to allocating resources to finding something that does have the full asymmetry that you're looking for.
I'll give you a few examples, and then we'll do some Q&A, because I could talk for hours and hours and hours about this, the bimodal strategy. The important thing is you got to recognize when you're in the middle and get out. You can move through the middle. You could absolutely take a brand new business, which is inherently over here, because we don't know much about it, realize it doesn't have upside, but it would be a great asset, build systems, operations, hire people, and so you might spend some time going through the middle of the barbell, but you got to get it all the way over, which most people never make that final, little bit of percent. So I'll just give you some examples of ways this might work out really well. I'm gonna try to be a little bit diverse so it's not super myopic, is if you do have a business or a job, I tend to argue that jobs are not as reliable as people think they are, like a lot of people found out when they got furloughed. But if you do have a business and you are able to get it to the reliable side of the barbell, it's consistent, it's reliable, you get what you expect to get, you could take some of this capital, and you don't need much over here, right? You just flip it over. That could be your barbell. Got my business, and I got my investments over here. Take it a step further, you could have a percentage of your investments in something much safer and more reliable and insured, and it'll have a lower return, but it's cool, and the rest over there on the upside. Because this is what people get really messed up about asymmetry, because we're all greedy a-holes. The point of the asymmetric bet, the reason we like asymmetric bets is because you don't have to ape into them. That's the point. You can take $100 and turn it into $100,000. It has that potential. You can also lose it all. But the beauty about the upside plays, cryptocurrencies and startups, is they can multiply greatly. Of course, what our brain does is go, ooh, then I should put more in if that could happen. But that actually kind of defeats the purpose of the asymmetry, because you're actually increasing the downside. When you start taking money out of your kid's college fund to get more upside, you're actually increasing downside. Does that make sense? So in terms of like Wolf Den stuff and certainty methodology, a balanced barbell, in my mind, is actually working on getting the reliable side on track to fund your solvable problem. Any overage, you can flip into high risk, high return, cryptocurrency, startups, and because you're on track with the reliable side, you don't need Bitcoin to go to 100 grand tomorrow. It just has to get there eventually, and even if it doesn't, it's fine because I'm on track with my reliable side. Okay? So we've got a little bit of resource allocation. Don't allocate resources to the middle, and we want to make sure that, especially if we are people that chase upside, that we're balancing this out. We have a reliable side, we have an upside side. Okay? Or unreliable. And we have to be super intentional about, for your question, if you have stuff in the middle of the barbell, you got to get it out of the middle. That might be moving it over to the reliable side. And that's going to take, it's hard. If you have a business, getting it to run without you is hard, or getting it to run consistently with you in it is still hard. You might just decide to set it aside and leave it as a upside play. Like if, for example, you got $1 million of Bitcoin and you are actively trading it for 10 hours a day. You're in the middle. You got a job. You could just be like, you know what? I'm going to put this Bitcoin, I'm going to just put it in a hardware wallet and forget about it. So you've actually moved it to the upside side of the barbell, and you've recaptured the resources, your time, and your bandwidth. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is conceptually what I recommend you place stuff on, especially investments. Dan has there's barbells inside of barbells inside of barbells. Like you look at your whole life. You can also look at one business, and you will have components of your business that are upside components. You just added them because you think it's going to have a huge upside. There's parts of your business that are super reliable. There's parts of your business that are effing horrible because they're neither. You could even go look at that part of your business. There's another barbell in there where there's components that are reliable and there's components that have upside. So you could zoom in, you could zoom out, and we just want to start moving stuff out of the middle. Yeah.
I just want to share, for my practical application, ever since you first talked about it, it really helped me understand where I am in my business. Because for me, there was a point in my business where I was a technician and I couldn't let go of things. But when you showed me that I really, as a visionary, as a business owner, I need to be playing in the explore phase of playing with the unknown and having my team converted into a reliable system. That helped me understand my place and also understand the importance of their place as well to show the balance of the barbell. To actually share that with my team, it makes more sense on the purpose of their job and where I need to be living and living as a visionary to bring growth and opportunity for the company. So that's how I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And there's explore, exploit, MED, MRV, et cetera. But again, at the highest level, you find that there's two high efficacy solutions to many problems, right? Or the solution falls on one end of the spectrum. Minimum effective dose or max core volume. So just as an example of another bimodal structure is MED MRV, which is like, if I can maintain the way that I look and feel by exercising 3 times a week for an hour each time, right? So 3 hours a week. But to change, because it's much harder to change complex systems than it is to maintain them. Okay? So if to change the way that I look, I would have to exercise every day for an hour a day, 7 hours. Then I will maintain the way, I will maintain at 3, and I need 7 to change. So that means 4, 5, and 6, anything between 3 and 7 is wasted energy. It doesn't help me maintain. I do that with 3, and it's not enough to change. Right? So middle of the barbell is almost always hemorrhaged resources. If it doesn't have the upside to cash you out, and it's not reliable, how is it really serving you? Outside of paying your bills today, if you got to there's always that exception of people that need to figure out how to put food on their table tonight. Different conversation, not people in this room. Right? So we just want to conceptualize this barbell and make sure that what we're doing is falling on it in a way that gets us closer to what we want. Right? So and I'll just add this, my disposition, I'll tell you how I personally build my barbell, and then we can talk a little bit about Certainty U, is I really like to work and provide value and do stuff for people. Right? So for me, because I like to do that, I don't look at crypto, and I have a crypto project. I don't look at crypto as something that I'm going to pay the bills with day to day. I don't cash out crypto. I don't need to cash out crypto. I know I don't need to because I have a barbell structure in my head that informs me on how I'm going to get what I want. So this is also the safest, in my opinion, with an emerging new technology like crypto, is, do you know how many people got into cryptocurrency for like 6 months and then shut their business down? I don't need to do business anymore. I'm going to do crypto. They don't understand the barbell. They do not understand the process of domesticating risk while maintaining upside. They just said F it and chased upside. That's why a lot of them are in a lot of pain right now. Some people do it intuitively, some people are structured with it. If you had a barbell structure and you maintain that barbell structure, this bimodal structure, going into something like crypto or any new exciting emerging thing, you're not in nearly as much pain. Because your reliable side is still your reliable side. That shouldn't have changed based on what the market did. Does that make sense? So this is how we domesticate the risk and we keep the upside. A whole bunch of people did exactly that. We'll just pick on Bitcoin. Bought Bitcoin at $50,000. Do I think Bitcoin's gonna go over $50,000? Yeah, I think it's gonna go way over $50,000, sure. But it's sure as shit's not reliable. We don't know when. I can't put that on the reliable side of my barbell. So they buy Bitcoin at $50,000, right? They don't have a reliable side because they didn't think about this kind of structure. They think about domesticating the risk while maintaining the upside. So here's what happened. They don't have a reliable income. Then they had to sell all their Bitcoin at 30 grand. Hurry up and recoup it all because they got to pay for shit in the near future, right? They also just got rid of their upside. They just sold the asset that represented the upside to them because they put themselves in a position to do so by not domesticating the risk. Does that make sense? So no matter what you think, like Dan would say preponderance of data, if you think an asset is going to go 1,000,000x this year, great. It still goes on that side of the barbell. You thinking it and a bunch of influencers saying it does not make it reliable. A preponderance of data over time makes it reliable. Preponderance, it's a fun word. It's Dan's word.
I like that word.
All right, does that all make sense?
It's a fun word.
You're going to conceptualize the barbell and how it's multifaceted. A lot of people will try to just say investments, which is fine, or businesses, which is fine. I think it's a disservice to not consider that everything you do kind of works together. So you could have a business plus some investments here and different class of investments over there or a different class of businesses over there, but they all work together. And I see it in crypto. Where people somehow act like crypto is separate from the rest of their life. So they don't have like all these components of their life working together in a way that you can domesticate the downside, because remember, the risk is that you don't get what you want. It's not more, right? So you can domesticate the probability that you don't get what you want if you have effectively thought through this bimodal strategy. That side might go up and down. It might not do what you want it to do. That's why it's on that side. That's why we put it on that side, and that's why we make sure that we have a reliable side, and we got to plan accordingly. Does all that make sense? Cool. Do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things to it. So the question, so I think this is really helpful to understand, but I want to tie it back to practical questions that I think we ask, like, can I afford to buy a thing? Like, I want to buy a bigger house. I want to go on an expensive trip. Maybe I want to send my kids to private school. I've got, like most of you know, I got 2 young kids. So there's this, kind of constant, can I have this, can I have that? And understanding this barbell strategy can help inform whether or not you're in a position to buy something, or like specifically to commit to a larger ongoing expense. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. So say you have a couple good months in your business, you got more cash in your account than you ever had, and so the tendency might be to go, well, yeah, we're doing pretty well. I can afford this now. We have all this cash in our account. Well, then the question is, where is that cash coming from? Because if the cash is coming from this side of the barbell where it's inconsistent, it's not reliable, then you may not actually be in a position to commit to this new, bigger ongoing expense. So from a practical application perspective, if I'm going to add a new expense to the ongoing commitment, a bigger house, bigger mortgage payment, bigger car payment, private school, any of those sort of things, I need that cash to come from this side, the reliable side. because I don't want that added pressure, right? Because there's a possibility that the cash is coming from this unreliable side of things. I commit to it. This is a recipe for blowing myself up. Right? I just committed to this bigger expense. All that cash that I thought provided the basis for me to be able to afford it comes from the unreliable side. Now all of a sudden something happens, market forces, economy, so on and so forth. My income goes down. I can no longer afford it. I could have foretold that story from the beginning if I just put the income source on the right side of the barbell. Right? Does that make sense? So can I afford to buy a thing? If it's a one-time purchase, I can take proceeds from the unreliable source if I already have the cash. If it's an ongoing expense, I want to fund it from the predictable, reliable business. So you can then use that to inform your stakeholders. In this case, my spouse, right? So I'm the primary income earner in my household. That's the way that we've constructed things. It works really well for us, right? So, and I don't want to feel like I'm the parent. I don't want to tell my wife what she can and can't do, and she doesn't want to feel like she has to come and ask me, right? That's not a very romantic relationship if you're like mom and dad to each other, right? So I don't want to be in that scenario where I'm having to tell her yes or no. And so what we do is write the rules in advance, okay? So here's what the reliable, consistent business needs to get to for us to afford this next expense. Okay, now I'm going to commit to working to get to that. And so once that happens, then then we can sort of buy the bigger house, get the car, whatever it may be. And so we're just aligned on the source of where that money is coming from. I'm not saying yes or no. It's just this is the source. Once it gets there, by all means, let's do it. But I don't want to take from the inconsistent, unreliable side of things and then find myself over leveraged, and then now we're in this like contentious really scenario where we bought something that now we can't afford, like the house poor scenario that I'm sure I've been in before, and I'm sure some of you have experienced or you've heard friends go through that. So that's how I practically apply this. Does anybody have any questions about that? Does that make sense? So what can be a gut punch is when you go through this exercise and you realize that you don't have a barbell, but you have a kettlebell, right? Because you only have businesses here, or you only have businesses here, and you don't have anything in between, right? Or I guess you could have a kettlebell because everything is in the middle.
Yeah, I think so. Just a few mistakes, because typically people have way more questions. I don't know if you guys have seen this before, or typically this people struggle a little bit to place themselves in the situation on this. So it's great, unless you guys just don't want to ask questions because you hate us. It's cool. But the biggest risk is that humans are humans, because that's what we do, and we take reliable things. There's all these stories, all these anecdotes about if you know Joe Polish or Gary Halbert or any of the legendary marketers, they're always writing about like, I've been banned from my office because everything is just rolling smoothly, and then I walk in and it's like everything catches on fire, right? Because we do that. We take reliable things and we're like, ooh, let's tinker with this. So the risk is we take reliable things and we make them unreliable. What I see in crypto is you have this high upside, and you see it other places too, this high upside play that's, people say, yeah, I'm on a 10-year time preference, home run shot, yada, yada, yada. And then they turn it into a job. You've actually removed a lot of the asymmetry, because the asymmetry is random, right? That's like the crypto is random as shit. It just goes way up exactly when nobody expects it to. So by actively participating in it, so you take your reliable stuff, you put them in the middle, and then you have these upside things and you turn them into jobs. So now you're right back in the middle again. And like we gravitate towards this because that's what our human mindset does. It wants us to like just work really hard for not that much return, like for whatever reason. So it's a constant battle to keep, like, understand this bimodal strategy. Understand when something's reliable it has a purpose, because we'll try to like make it like better. It's reliable, but we can make it better. And if in doing so we make it less reliable, we're getting further away from actually having a strategy where we have domesticated as much of the risk as possible and kept as much of the upside as possible.
Yeah.
So, question on, so I've got multiple businesses, one for rent, and I'm trying to figure out, like on the agency side, because it's not reliable, because when the market changes, you have less market for and the upside is probably working more in the business, like it feels like it's in the middle because of those reasons.
But it doesn't have to be, because Dan knows this better because he's in, so for example, I came from the fitness world and he's in the tax world, right? So we could say, well, you know, fitness is so unreliable because New Year's comes and there's all these resolutioners and they go away. Reliable does not necessarily mean consistent, right? So like tax season, flood of new clients and then they're gone. But if it's doing the same thing every year and you can recognize what Dan calls the rhythms, it's still reliable. So there's a distinction between reliable and consistent over shorter time periods. Does that make sense? So if you can identify the pattern and it reliably follows that pattern, you can still adjust your behavior accordingly. That's what when I talk about reliability, I'm just saying, what is the probability that things shake out the way I expect them to? Because I can moderate my own behavior around that. It's when I think I'm going to work 5 hours tomorrow and I end up having 12 that I have no room or space or freedom to plan anything else or even start anything else or think about anything else. So I think of reliability means you don't have fires all the time you're putting out. And there's the business rhythms, which Dan can speak to in his tax business, is that there's rhythms. And look, if it's like your 5th or 6th or 10th year owning an accounting firm and you are still surprised.
God help you.
What's that?
I said God help you, but
Yeah. So, but if you have to put out a bunch of fires because it's tax season, but this is like the 13th year it's happened, that's on you. Like, you know, so just a distinction between like consistent flat line versus reliability.
But you mentioned property management business, so so you have rentals. So that's an example that I could argue could be both. Okay, so the rent, having renters, collecting rent, that's on one side is consistent, predictable, right? And there's a rhythm to it. You can reasonably anticipate occupancy rates and so on and so forth. Then the fair market value appreciation side of how much are these rental properties going to be worth in the future, that's on the other side. So in a very short-term time horizon, if you were just banking on the property appreciation, you could crush it or you could get crushed. Right? But if you expand it to a 3, 5, 10-year time horizon, you're probably going to break even or do well, right? So property appreciation, it's on the risk reward, more reward side, the rental income more predictable. So you can take a business and do the same thing. You know, like, okay, taxes is a very predictable, consistent business. Consulting, not. Same business, two different scenarios within that.
I'll give you an example of a business that has a barbell built in. Because it's recent. We're sitting at the Metropolitan Grill and we were talking about this last night. If you have a business that has been moved to the reliable side, so you did the work, operations, it's profitable, how long has the Metropolitan been there?
I don't know, 30 or more years.
Yeah, 30 years. It's always busy. So you have a cash flow positive business, right? And maybe a couple other businesses around you paying you rent, and you own the building, right? The upside is in the fact that building is probably appreciated many, many, many millions of dollars, right? But there's also a reliable business plus people paying rent inside the building. So it can be like that simple too. You run a business, own the building that you run your business in, and have a bunch of other tenants pay you rent. If the business is reliable and the tenants are paying, that is a barbell. Like that business is a nice barbell. You don't need to do anything else.
Ben, you had a question, then Lucas.
Yeah. Curious how you think about balancing or thinking about how getting what you want, solving the problem, getting the reliable side on track towards doing that. The upside, because like you mentioned, for example, coming to a lot of it's honestly, right? Coming in terms of okay, this business, for example, or this job, or wherever it is, it's not an upside play, it's not even. So move to the reliable side, but then depending on your definition of what you want, right? If you say you want $20 million in 3 years, you also could clearly say like this reliable side is not on track for that. How do you balance like those different goals with?
Well, you would have to, and I'm going first because I want to hear Dan's answer. You would have to decide, am I going to get rid of this business? Okay, I'm going to walk through this whole process. It's in the middle of the barbell, right? Am I going to get rid of it? No. I assume for you guys, no, I'm not going to get rid of this. So what choice do I have other than to make it reliable as possible? And then once it is reliable, figure out how much time I get left. And then with that time, we're going to figure out how to close the gap, right? But if you're not going to get rid of the business and it's not an upside play, which we could challenge you, maybe those are not correct assumptions. But in my mind, you'd have no choice but to move it over to the reliable side, because once it's reliable, you will recapture time and energy and bandwidth. And then, we're going to have to find another way to close the gap. Yeah, but it's better than sitting in the middle, not wanting to accept it, And there may be a way to reconfigure your business so there's more upside. It's possible. But does that make where you sometimes just like through process of elimination, if you're not going to, the next step, the only logical next step, in my opinion, is to move it to the reliable side. So if that's the only logical next step, then just do that. Don't worry about the rest. Just do that.
Yeah, don't worry about what's going to happen after you do that.
Because moving your business to the reliable side, you don't know what's going to reveal itself. You have no idea how much free time you might have. If you actually moved it over and systematized it, you might be as busy as you are now. You might have more free time than you ever imagined. We don't know. So how can we possibly make decisions on what would be next, given the fact there's a big void in data that will be available then? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a couple questions when it's stuck in the middle. The first is, am I willing to do the things that would allow me to move it to the right side with high upside? So in the case, I'll just use this CPA for an example. I could turn it into a 10x business. I could go get private equity and I could go buy the hundreds of practices that are available for sale. I'd be really miserable, right? So then I'd have to play somebody else's game. I have a friend, we have a mutual friend, who's rolling up restaurant accounting groups across the country. Sounds terrible to me. But the way that they're doing it, they have a lot of asymmetry because I'm not going to get into all the details, but they're willing to do things I'm not willing to do. Right? So inherently then, how do I move it to the other side, the reliable side? Now because of my orientation of least amount of effort, least amount of risk, most amount of options, I go back to my solvable problem. How much do I need to make per year to fund at least my core priorities? And we can come back to what that means for everyone's benefit shortly, but how do I get it to a point where I can fund all my core priorities in a timeline that's acceptable to me? So I'm going to try to optimize that as much as possible so that it's freeing up resources and generating cash. And so that may require me to come to terms with the fact that I'm no longer going to grow it. And maybe I've spent 10, 15 years trying to grow it to some massive company. Now I have to come to terms with, no, I think I can generate $500,000 a year on $2 million in revenue. I don't need to grow it anymore. Actually, I'm going to shrink it a little bit because if I shrink it a little bit, I can cut out a bunch of overhead that doesn't need to exist to try and scale, and now I have a business that's more predictable and reliable. So question one, Can I manufacture the asymmetry? And if so, am I willing to do it? Do all the things, raise capital, so on and so forth. If not, how do I get it to a place where it's going to fund my core priorities in an acceptable time frame? And then the call that we're on, the journey that we're on, is to continue, recognize that's an infinite game, continually optimize that, because we're trying to free up resources. So your team, when you make this decision that you're now optimizing for your solvable problem with this reliable business, is that they're going to, and if Randy was here, he'd speak to it better than I will right now, but they're going to try and govern your speed limit. But there's going to be a bunch of friction because you've turned your attention away from this business to other things. And so you have to build into this process re-enrolling everyone and what's going on, and some cadence, some rhythm to your business of, okay, I'm going to turn my attention to it, but I got to come back to them every 3 months and re-engage with them, or some cadence that keeps people involved. And so does that answer your question?
There's a layer of, just because I want to layer it on here, there's a little bit of, like Dan just mentioned it, and he went through the process where we say, okay, to make this reliable, I might have to scale back a little bit. That's really hard for people to be like, okay, in order to make this reliable, I'd have to do this, but I would lose $100,000 a year. I'm going backwards, but then we go back to, we bias asymmetry to the upside. If you lose $100,000 a year, but you get back 20 hours a week, right? It's an asymmetric bet. Like, you win big time on that one. So I'm just tying it back in because it's like principle on top of principle. We just got to keep processing through these things.
Well, let's do a little hand raise exercise. Who here, by show of hands, would like to make more and do less? Now, I expected everyone's going to raise their hand. Now, in our business, I'm like, you can make $200,000 more, but we're going to have to cut back on revenue. And you're like, whoa, hold on. I've worked so hard to grow this business. So our behaviors don't necessarily align. We will all raise our hand and say, yes, I would like to make more by doing less. But then our behaviors usually, let me try and do more to have a chance to make more. So one has a high probability of, like, we can map it out right now, cut it back, here's the extra profit. But then we choose let's grow it, which doesn't have a guaranteed outcome of profitability. Humans. You had a comment on that, or did you have a question?
Some sort of update on this.
Oh, okay. And then we'll go to you, Lucas.
Needed to this learning 6 months.
It's always when you learn the best stuff. Sometime way after you needed it.
Yep. I get it. A lot of the stuff that I share comes from a position of having done it before, and having done it before oftentimes had to learn the lesson more than once. So again, as Randy would say, go to school on our tuition. Lucas.
Perspective, but then a barbell appears static, but it's actually not. You're moving, and in our world, you're trying to move towards a solvable problem, which most people are kind of trying to solve for more. We're trying to solve for closer. What you built into the certainty app is that percentage of basically making sure that you're on track to hit your solvable problem within your time frame. And the models that you've used there are, if you're exceeding that time frame, you should bias reducing the risk, going back and making things more reliable, building the floor. Is there a world where you're dipping below your projection or whatever, that you would take something that is currently reliable, but you're not going to hit your thing, and doing more risk with the thing that's reliable, or do you take what you have and start something new, or take an alternate risk or whatever? Is there a calculus there?
I'll let Dan handle the calculus part. I just talk about very broad stroke things. But I just want to, there is a world I think there is a world where you do a version of that, because the biggest risk is that you don't get what you want. So we certainly don't want to. One, there's like a revisiting, is this actually what I want, or did I just say this because things were really good and I was being greedy? So there's always these gut check moments. It's always the gut check, you know, which some of you have been through. It's like, so first the gut check, but then in my opinion, the biggest risk is that you don't get the things that matter most to you. So we certainly don't want to lock in, like, oh, look, move everything to the reliable side where I guarantee I do not get the things that matter most to me. So in my opinion, very, very broad general language, that is actually the riskiest thing to do. If risk is not getting what you want or what matters to you, then locking in not getting what you want seems pretty risky. So there's a ton of conversation. Dan probably could work through this, and obviously he'll answer. That there's some like, do you take from the reliable side? I try never to rob Peter to pay Paul, right? So maybe you just pull some all-nighters. That's the risk. What risk do you take is the question at that point. But I think there's a world where you can't just go, hey, look, I thought the S&P was going to get 9% and it's getting 5%, and projections suggest it's never going to get more than 6 for some reason. That's not actually happening. But well, then sitting here on the reliable side just locks in that I don't get what matters most to me. So we have to take enough risk to get to have some probability that we actually get what we want. Does that answer the question a little bit? You can give a...
Yeah, I mean, at a little bit of a disadvantage because not everyone's on the same page in terms of all the different principles and things, but the process that I would go through is the 4-lens approach, which is what are all the opportunities that I have available to me, and then what I'm going to filter through them. So some of you will get caught up to speed in this in a few weeks. I'm going to filter through it and figure out what is going to have the highest probability of success, checks all the boxes. I'm going to put my energy there to get it to close the remaining gap on the reliability side. And then to the extent to which I've closed the gap, then I'm going to reallocate excess resources to the home run plays. So the answer may be within my existing business, adding the highest leverage thing might be adding another line of business or hiring another person. Or the highest leverage thing might be some new business or existing relationships, or there's an infinite number of scenarios, right? I'm trying to figure out the one that's going to have the highest probability of success and take the least amount of effort.
And the lowest probability of, just to throw this out there, because this is a big one, the lowest probability of complete ruin. Like going to the casino is probably not the best risk to take.
Cal?
My businesses are in the middle, they're in barbell, and when I say businesses, I have some that are, we'll say, a better milk cup than the others. To get them, speaking to maybe an analogy here, like if I'm into fitness, and quite a fitness or health in my life, to get them another 30% growth, it would take a lot more time. Like it may be maybe a competitive bodybuilder, it's gonna take a bunch more time to get to that stage. So what we're suggesting is back off, maybe reduce revenue, get it more reliable, less of my time, but is it appropriate then to allocate the time? Like say, okay, I'm down to 40 hours a week, or I'm down to 30 hours a week, I have 10 extra hours. I want to take maybe 10% of the revenue that this milk cow is putting out, and I want to put it over to the high risk, high reward. I'm going to take 10 hours of my week and work on one of my wild hair quick start businesses that I actually think has the potential. Would that be appropriate like allocation of time in the barbell?
I think so. I'm a big fan of minimum effective dose. You'd be surprised that you could probably stop doing like half the stuff you're doing, and your business will kick out the same it's kicking out now, almost every time, So you get all that time back. I would just be careful. I mean, I would just work through the certainty app at the solvable problem. So we're not taking an arbitrary 10%. I'm not a big fan of arbitrary numbers, but I don't know. I think that's how we typically think about it.
Yeah.
Realization would be that something turn, like one goes off, and
it starts to consume time, then you reevaluate, like, do I need to do this reliable or do I need this more possible?
That's right. Yeah. I reserve the right to change my mind. So at some point, it may move from being reliable to upside play or vice versa. And so typically what we would say is Investor Frame once a quarter, we're going to ask ourselves those questions, reevaluate where they're positioned, see if it still makes sense. Ultimately, the game that we're playing to close the gap is to recover and reallocate resources to the things that are going to get us there faster. No, that was good. That was a good summary. We're going to put you up here next time. Paul and then Jay.
Yeah, so that was what worked for me. Reliable and reducing costs, just like cut back on the amount of money we're spending, and nothing broke, right? It's like your point about you might be able to just stop doing a lot of things you're doing and nothing will change. That was true for us. And then we also recognize that the business functioned primarily as a relationship driver, adding not necessarily reliability in terms of consistent cash flow, but consistently getting us more and more relationships that we wanted. And once I realized that, it was like, okay, we'll take the marketing money and spend it on relationships, and now our relationships turn into upside. And so the key takeaway I had was find things that add to both sides of the barbell. Like that's what I'm saying, as for example. But I think relationships also can have a lot of upside as well. Treat them.
CCA is similar. I'll share. I don't know how much I'm supposed to share, but we love teaching CCA. It's not it cannot be a infinite upside business, but ultimately we show up and deliver, and we do the best we can for all of you. I think everybody in here is CCA, and but there's a tremendous upside in goodwill in the fact that all of you are going to go do amazing things. But we do also, one of the secondary things is we pick up partners. Like we identify one or two people per cohort that have a $1 billion, multi-billion-dollar idea that we can throw fire on, and that's an upside. So there's an upside to the CCA, even though the CCA is not an upside business inherently. It's very similar.
Cool. Yeah, the simple activity that you can go through in terms of trying to recover and reallocate resources, you take all your expenses, sort them by vendor relationship, and then you just ask, is it a core expense or not? And core would mean the business could not exist unless we had this expense. So is it core or is it not? And so for the ones that you say yes, then you ask yourself the question, how do I know that I'm right? And is it really, I might be biased, it's a sacred cow. I would say we name the puppy on it. Some of you heard that anecdote. So I said yes, how do I know that that's the case? But for all the ones that I said no, then the question is, well, why am I still doing it? It's not core to the business. Now, there's probably some assumption that you made. Oh, this is saving me time, getting more energy from this. There's some ROI assumption that you made that by paying for this expense that's not core to my business, it's going to create some new opportunity. So then I would say, where's the data to prove that? And so often what I find when we've gone through these exercises with folks is that they can eliminate almost every non-core expense because they can't actually demonstrate that there's an ROI. And so then you eliminate all that. There's your excess resources to fund your solvable problem. Now you can do the same thing with tasks. Is this task core to my business? Yes or no? Meaning the business I have to do this for the business to exist. The ones you say no, those are speculative. Those are things you are investing back into the business because you thought it was going to grow the business. Now, do I have any evidence to support that that's been true? Right? And if not, why am I continuing to do it? So that's sort of a process to try and recover and reallocate.
We have a CCA student that went through this, and no, I need all these things. And then you have the conversations, recaptured $50,000 a month. 600 grand a year. You got to think about with whatever their profit margins are, that's millions of dollars of sales. Just recaptured, sitting right there.
Mhm.
So it's good. Good exercise to go through frequently. Any other questions about the barbell?
Jay, yeah, sorry.
Is less risk and high reward reliable. But I've been one that's been putting out fires for 19 years. I guess I never learned. It seems like to me the industry is that tight that just puts me in that situation every year. So it's against my natural beliefs, which is like it's not bringing me closer to the long, like it's taking time away from my family, but it's on the reliable side, and the reward is there. If I take that out from this side, then I'm barbell falls the other way. Is that something that you would not recommend? Would you say, do I wait to find something else to replace that before I make that jump to something? I mean, it's kind of conflicting to.
Yeah, I have a number of questions, but you can go ahead, Nick.
I think maybe today we'll walk all the way through the investor frame. I think that'll help. That's all.
Oh, okay. All right. So when you have a business that is, I think you described as reliable, but you have a bunch of fires, then the question is, am I actually treating it like a reliable business, or am I treating it like a business that I'm trying to grow? Because it may be that you're trying to innovate in too many areas, that if we just called a spade and went, this is what's going to happen every year, and we design processes that and staffing related to that the problem goes away. Does that make sense? Because if you know that things are going to break, like you know the cadences in which it's going to break, right? And so how do we acknowledge that that's going to happen rather than fight against it?
So we could say solvable problem, macro belief, what do I actually want? The barbell, by the way, we always have to orient towards closer. So something can absolutely reliably get you further away. Just because it's reliable, we have to make sure that it's reliably getting us closer. It's kind of an underpinning of everything. But the investor frame, which I think we'll just probably do the exercise, but I would think about, and this is Dan's intellectual property, but it's given what I know, whatever the firm is worth, given what I know today, would I pay this much to own it and have it be exactly like it is today? Oftentimes the answer is no, because now I know my solvable problem, my macro belief, and all that stuff, right? So the next question is, what would need to be true for me to say yes? And then if possible, if it's feasible, like, well, I would need to stop putting out fires, I'd have to have processes in place, then that's like your 90-day plan, really, is to get you to say yes to the thing you're already doing. If the answer is no, like, would I opt into this? No. What would need to be true for me to say yes? Well, the tax deadline would have to go away. But that's not going to happen, so you got to get rid of it. Right? So it's helpful to figure out that question, which is what would need to be true for me to actually say yes, this is reliably getting me closer to what I want?
Yeah.
Because that'll tell. Then are you willing to do it? We just peel it back like one step at a time. And surprisingly, a lot of times when people are like, fuck this, I'm done, and you actually like peel it back, it's very doable. It's very manageable. And I wish I had known this. I have 3 companies in particular that I wish I had the processes and the thinking patterns that I have now, because I would be a lot closer to all the things that I want had I not just said, F it, this sucks, putting out fires, I'm out.
You would have this one, what you would have had some kind of different possibility or something.
Yeah,
You know,
there's a little bit of all or nothing thinking, and there's also just the question that's most valuable to me is what would need to be true for me to say yes. I would need this, this, and this. It would have to be this way. And then there's a series of like, well, how can I make this? And you might go, you know what, this is not possible. Okay. But indeed, the three scenarios I'm thinking of in particular, and the people involved, like, yeah, it probably would have been possible had I had any idea how to like just peel it back one layer at a time instead of yes or all or nothing. I just didn't have the, I was like 25. I just didn't have
The thing that I've started asking folks, I don't think I've even shared this with you, Nick, is part of the investor frame is asking, first, do you resent this business? I'm curious. Yeah, do you resent it?
Pretty much provided.
Okay, so you don't have a bunch of what I would describe as baggage. Do you resent your clients? Yeah. So that makes it really difficult to come up with the solutions, right? Because it's easy to feel like there isn't a solution because we can allow ourselves to be a bit of a victim to the moment, right? So, I know this business, and I have certainly felt moments of resentment, so I'm not trying to call you out whatsoever. But how would I move to a position where I no longer resented my clients? What would be necessary for that to occur? And that is often the solution to the problem. Right? But because there's so much anger or vitriol, I can't see it, right? Which is getting stuck in that victim position. So what I know about tax season, no matter what we do, is we've had good years where we crushed it, we've had good years where we've fallen down, that no matter what, the last 2 weeks leading up to a deadline is going to be brutal. There's nothing, doesn't matter, right? Leading up to 3/15, 4/15, 9/15, 10/15, those 2 weeks, it doesn't matter, right? So now I can just accept that as truth. And then I can look at the history of the data over, in your case, 19 years, and you can figure out, stratify the data into buckets of who gets me stuff on time, who's late, who's last minute, like create some categories, because then you can reasonably anticipate what's going to happen. Now, it's not always the same people every year, but just accepting, okay, well, 20% of the people I'm going to have to follow up with 5 times, and they're going to get me stuff with 3 days to go. Okay, well, I'm just going to, now I'm planning for those things to occur. I can build the processes around it, and or part of building the process around it is charging them accordingly. So what I know about accounting firms is we tend to be people pleasers and we tend to resent our clients because we never tell them exactly what we need, and we don't say, hey, you know what, I can get your return done, or you replace return with work if you want, because this doesn't have to just be accounting firm specific. And I tell my team this all the time, and we don't do a good job executing on it because we're a bunch of people pleasers. But the message from a preeminence position is, if you turn my stuff in, your stuff in the next week, I can get it done in 2 weeks after that. If you wait until next week, I won't be able to get your stuff done for 2 more months. So we're letting them know, and they get to choose. Now, inevitably, they might come back and give it to you late and still ask for a quick turnaround, and then you have the choice to say, we can do it, but it's going to cost, I already told you, it's going to cost significantly more, or we're going to have to wait. But we tend to avoid having those conversations of telling them what's going to happen and then holding them, and then because we didn't tell them what was going to happen, then we also can't hold them accountable. But then we resent them because we feel like we got to get the work done. So hopefully that's helpful. Could also just be me projecting.
All right. I feel like we're missing people. Oh, Tom just left.
I'm going to sit down.
Yeah, good
Keep
call.
going.
This is a good decision. Least amount of risk, least amount of effort, most amount of options. I have so many options. I could stand back up again. I could face this way.
Do some jumping jacks.
Yeah, it's
All right, Nick, what do you got?
Yeah, so we have, there's more stuff that typically we would do. And we could talk about the investor frame a little bit, but I think with the smaller group and people that have been through CCA, the most useful thing is like little round table or Q&A. Typically we don't have an opportunity to do that because we have so much new content, but it's not new to you guys, so we don't really have to cover it. We can just do two things. So the two things that I think we should do. One is write down the investor frame and think about it, journal about it, and we could talk about it another time. But I think it's important that quarterly we just at least write this down and think about it, which is, given what I know today, would I opt back into this? If not, what would need to be true for me to say yes? And this is just recapturing and reallocating every quarter, because things do change. And we want to make sure that, so step one, it's I wrote it in bumpers, it's baked into the CCA methodology. In order to get closer to the things that you want, stop doing things that get you further away from what you want. Like, don't do dumb stuff. Don't make poor decisions. A poor decision in this case would be a decision that gets you further away from what you want. Now, if we don't want to make poor decisions because it's silly, then a poor decision would be violating our current economic and personal principles, which are, which governed by what we want. So, if we are in a situation right now that is violating our own economic and personal principles, it's like we're making a new bad decision every single day. So one, stop making stupid decisions. Two, there are decisions that may have been good decisions before that are now violating your economic and personal principles by like having resources in a home that you wouldn't buy today. This is an example Dan uses all the time. Right? Well, if you wouldn't buy this home today at its current market value, then you're violating your own economic principles by having that much capital in it. So I would just write that down, and as you're coming up with things, as you're drawing out your barbell, and you're going, okay, here's my business and this investment and this relationship and this partnership, just like Ann, you start asking yourself that question: given what I know today, would I opt back into this exact same situation? And a lot of times, the answer is no. If it's yes, great. You're not violating your current economic and personal principles. Awesome. You can say yes to everything. Great. We'll do it again next quarter. And if you say yes again, great. We'll do it again next quarter. But we just want to make sure that we're taking our foot off the brake, so to speak. And we can't do it every day. We have to function. We have to wake up and do stuff and be productive, so we can't investor frame every day. So I would write that down and reflect on it. And as you're working out through your barbell and all this stuff, before you start moving it around, I would ask yourself that question first, because it may also inform you on how to move it. Like, what are the steps I need to take to make it reliable? Well, you got to figure out, as Dan said, you got to figure out why you hate your clients. What would I need to do to not hate my clients anymore? That would basically be your 90-day plan. Do those things, put those things in place. And you may find out they can't be done, and now you know, but at least you did the work. So it really sucks for those of you that haven't done it. And it is what it is. It really sucks, though, to realize, look back and be like, wow, I could actually have made those things work, and I would be in a way better position had I known this. But I got impatient, and I thought all or nothing, and now, I don't have those things anymore. So just, even if you're pretty sure, just go through the process. Second, I think we do Q&A. I think we just kind of talk and see whatever, we got some time. We're going to walk away from here. Some of us will be here tomorrow. Obviously, you're welcome to join if you're here. But what is the thing that'd be the most useful to you walking away today? And if we can address some of that, then that's awesome. Cool? Anybody want to kick it off? Benjamin Frank.
I'm curious, in our kind of side chat before we started, you were talking about distribution. And had me thinking a lot just about, compared to barbell, curious how you think about risk versus reliability when it comes to distribution plays. For example, you think about, like, you gave the example of Arm & Hammer, and obviously I even think about like Starbucks and Coffee Bean, for example, at one point. Starbucks, right? I could be wrong in this analysis. One of the reasons why it was so successful with McDonald's, right, is that it's everywhere, and it's like becomes that reliable, that thing. With only a couple locations, it's not what it is. Right? Because the distribution, you could also argue that that's a massive risk of going that big. Right? So some industries, it seems like going bigger almost decreases risk because you're in a strong position, that big distribution or the shelf space that you talked about. So it's hard to determine if that's a risky play or if that's actually like the least risky play versus staying small and
Well, I think I'll give you my answer because we're probably going to do a separate video for the Wolf Den, really talking about what risk is, and that's a Dan thing. I can't articulate it. I don't understand it like he does. But on a broader scale, it comes back to what do you want? So if you want to spend a ton of time together as a couple and a bunch of time with your kids, then yeah, trying to scale a global business is a risk because it's more likely that you don't get what you want, right? So to me, it always comes back. I was hanging out with Dr. Alan Barnard. He's the founder of the Goldratt Institute, the theory of constraints. They founded the concept of theory of constraints. And conversation that we had is like, he's like, yeah, we peel back the onion. It's very similar to CCA principles, very, very similar, but here's the difference. They peel back the onion, they pull, I don't know why I'm peeling onions all day today, but just peeling onions. So we peel back layers and layers and layers, and we really get down to their framework is, this is how they thin slice complicated decisions. Which outcome gives us the best case scenario and the best worst case scenario? Sound familiar, right? But that's what they say, so there's this, which one has the most asymmetry to the upside? They don't say that language, they say best case scenario to worst case scenario. What are they both, and which one? They're saying asymmetry to the upside. And they're like, yeah, so we peel it all the way back, and we find out. So this company, it's a book publishing company, and they want to 10x their profit, and they think they got to 10x their revenue, but they don't have to. And then he explains how, cutting costs and margins, all this stuff. And the conversation I was having was like, yeah, I don't think you peeled it back far enough. Should you 10x your profit? Isn't that a question we should talk about? So it goes back to like the human. Like I'm big on the humanity of it. What are you actually trying to accomplish? And there are absolutely worlds where, if you didn't have kids and you two were both hard charging and you wanted to change the laundry detergent industry or something, like staying small, you're not gonna do it. So yeah, you might take on objectively more risk, but you're actually not. It's actually more risky to not go big because you can't accomplish the thing that you want if you don't. So I just think there's a lot about like how the human in charge is wired that we have to really consider that as important context.
Mm-hmm. Like, you can decide that's what you want. As well, that's what you can do, but it's clearly not what you want. It's not what you want to see.
Right. Yeah, I think, and you had mentioned distribution, and when you mention distribution, then we have to, who is doing the distribution, right? And so then we have to map that to, is this a transactional relationship-based business? So like in your business, distribution is what, getting more coaches and leaders in other markets, right? And so that is a massive challenge, right? To find the human to do it, to retain, to impart all the wisdom in doing it the way that you guys do, and then retaining them, right? Different risk profile than trying to distribute a product to a bunch of different Walmarts, grocery stores, Targets, whatever it may be, right? Totally different risk profile. So then back to the humanity of it all. Is that an undertaking that you want to endeavor to do? So a CPA firm sounds terrible to me, because the distribution is needing to get to the scale that my friend wants to get to, means having like 3,000 bookkeepers. I saw a few of you throw up in your mouth when I said that. So yeah, it feels not too dissimilarly, right? So that would be a much different endeavor than I have stating the obvious, than a product-based business. So I might be more inclined to scale the distribution of a product-based business for my personality than to want to scale a business where I have 3,000 employees. Right? I think the other side of it, a conversation that I've had to have with myself, but also with my buddy who was in town earlier this week. It's interesting. I was going to give this which is a lot of us start a business and then we give ourselves the title of CEO. And I'm CEO of an accounting firm, and I have to have this conversation. I had to have the same conversation with my friend, which is the person in charge really a CEO? You gave yourself the title of CEO, but are you really a CEO? And so the gut check to me, for me personally, is I'm not really a CEO. I'm more of a CFO. So for me to scale the business, then I have to be able to put my ego aside and actually hire someone to be a true CEO. Because the things that would be necessary, like I can come up with the strategies and ideas and all that, but sustaining the vision long term and rallying the troops with the staff and all the things the CEO needs to do, I don't want to do. It doesn't fit with my personality. Right? So that's like an ego check to some degree, because you start a business, you get the title of CEO, feels good maybe to tell everybody I'm a CEO, and then you go like, actually I'm not really a CEO. Like I still have the title, but I'm not really, because I don't behave like one. Nor do I want to, which means I kind of need to change either how I'm going to grow the business or who I'm going to bring in to grow the business. Right? Does that make sense? I don't know if I articulated that very well.
The hard part for knowledge, not even knowledge workers, because you could write a book, right? And you could 1,000x the distribution of the book and everybody's getting the same product. You could beer or Arm & Hammer, OxyClean. You reliably get about the same exact product no matter how much you scale. Whereas coaching, service, that's not happening, So it is a different risk profile, and it's just important to, the beautiful thing about like the coaching thing is much higher margins, so you don't necessarily have to scale as much. But the reliability goes down when we're talking about coaching, consulting. You can't, if you opened even franchises, about as close as you get, you still get different service every McDonald's you go to or whatever. So if that experience is really important, it's much harder.
Yes, Paul.
Curious to hear how you guys apply the personal relationships.
That's a good one for that.
Stuff outside of revenue generating activities, right?
It's really not much different. It's much, unless you're like total Asperger's and don't care, then it's more difficult because you got to navigate emotions, and like it's hard enough to look at your own business and be like, wow, I have emotions about this and struggle with that. But now you're dealing with two people's emotions. Even personal friendships, they can be very emotional when like somebody grew up with for 10, 15, 20 years and like they just don't fit anymore. So that's difficult. And then there's the second, third, and subsequent order consequences of like the friends' friends, and they don't fit with you anymore, but your wife still wants to be friends, and like it's far more complicated than a business, in my opinion, because you could be like, I hate you, business, and the business isn't like, but you're a bad person, or I hate you, Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's like, all right, cool, but your friends aren't. So, but I don't think it's much different. I think it's harder to be objective because you don't want to feel like a pretentious a-hole, we were talking about this at lunch. Like there's a level of when you start learning these things and you start observing people. This is my experience, and you start like getting in different. I grew up really poor, really, really, really poor, and the narrative amongst all of those my people is like rich people are evil and they're pretentious and they don't even want to be, they have their own clubs. They just pay more money to go be in their own clubs because they're total a-holes like that. And then, you know, as you grow, if you're doing work on yourself, you start to kind of understand why, like, yeah, I'm going to pay more money to go hang out with in that club of people because they support, you know, the what I'm doing and they understand it. So with relationships, in my opinion, it still fits on a barbell because you can have reliable acquaintances and friends is great. Like you understand, you ever have friends where you're like, hey, they said they'll be here at 9, I know they'll be here at 9, that's reliable. They said they'll babysit my kids, be here at 4:45, they're here at 4:45, it's reliable. You know, whatever. So there's a reliability component, which is important. I think it's really, really important. Hopefully in romantic relationships too, there's a reliability component. There's also an upside component. You even mentioned, right, a lot of the friendships you're making is an upside play. You may not know how it's going to play out, but there's an upside. So it still fits in the barbell. And it's still true that if there's no upside and they're not reliable, it's a fucking job to have them as a friend or a girlfriend or a wife. So like if you reason from the ground up, it's the same. It's just top down, it's tougher because you're looking at somebody's face and it's like a friend and you have all these associations and all these other people telling you how you're supposed to treat people. But people still fall on a barbell. They're reliable or they're not. There's upside in knowing them. You might deal with an unreliable friend because they have connections and they can open doors that you could never otherwise open. Right? You can absolutely have upside friends that are unreliable. I absolutely have upside friends that are unreliable. Yeah. Yep.
I think the emotion a lot of times is the old relationships, right? So you could apply that, you know, when I opt into this friendship, knowing what I know about this person today and what my value system is today. To me, that's where a lot of times where I've struggled with that, and I look at that, you know, someone that my husband and I were best friends with for 20 plus years. And I'm like, oh, would I opt into this friendship knowing this person today and the value system I have today? No.
That's the hard part about working on yourself, right? You can outpace.
That's why most people stop working on themselves. It creates a lot of like this friction because they experience this and they have to figure out all of this stuff. Yeah.
And it's definitely then when you do reallocate that time, so that's when I would put to that friendship, right? How do I just begin to reallocate that time to the exploit or whatever, explore to find the people that aren't my people. But we talk about this a lot about the importance of figuring out how do you deal with that friction, because it is that friction in the middle that's the problem, right? Is that constant pull of do I spend my time, do I let this person go, what do I do with it? Is it workable, right? In that investor frame, is it workable? Can I take this and what would have to change? And how can I be authentic to myself while also allowing that person the opportunity to either come to me or not? But I think it's completely applicable to the relationship.
I'm not this linear, but I probably do this in real time. I don't sit down and like make a spreadsheet and list all my friends.
I feel like you're mocking me right now, Nick.
Because I actually, we teach this stuff and people are like, they think that like we're implying you sit down and you like completely just spreadsheet with friends and you like grade them and do all these things. But you know, when you think about the bar, you just start to sort things naturally. And so yeah, I would deal with somebody being unreliable, and I will accept they're unreliable. I probably won't invite them to be places on time, but there's upside. And so they fit in my world that way. And there's also people that maybe don't have the upside, but like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you got your physiological needs, right? But then in there you got your community and belonging needs. So like, yeah, there's people that are just reliable. You know they're there for you. You know they're gonna show up on time. You know that you can go to a baseball game with them and they're great fans to hang out with. There's no upside outside of the fact that it just fulfills like this community and belonging needs that humans have. Like that's cool. They don't have to provide upside to be in your world if they're reliable. If they're neither, what the fuck are you doing? Spending time with them and putting resources into them. So it's the same kind of sorting mechanism. Like, do they fit in my world?
And this is probably an obvious B message, but someone who is just upside, not expending the energy getting frustrated when they're unreliable. Like if you already know they're unreliable, you gotta accept that and vice versa. So oftentimes we have all this consternation that exists because we're trying to fit them in the slot where they don't actually exist. Which, oh, by the way, we do the same thing with our business. We're trying to treat a business like it's reliable or vice versa when it's not. So that characterizing the problem from the beginning becomes like the very essential first step.
If you think of an asset, okay, cash, and you put it in the bank account and you get 2% interest. I don't even know where you get that 2% interest, but yeah, like
Pretty
cool. That's the reliable. You can look at it every day if you want. It's gonna do the same shit. Doesn't really matter. And you go Bitcoin. That's my upside play, right? You don't get to get mad at Bitcoin that it's not just linear going up in a straight line because it's an upside play. Like, place those things correctly in your mind, right? So if you had like a chart for how reliable your friend or your spouse or whatever it was, like you don't want to look at the upside chart. You just don't look at it, you know? Like just don't, because it just piss you off. But it belongs over there. Like, so it's helpful to just sort things so that you know. They might not come to your birthday, whatever.
Yeah.
Don't get mad.
Maybe don't tell your spouse if you've labeled them as on the upside chart or the predictably
Yeah.
reliable chart.
I think
That's
you're going to
not
have
marriage advice.
very attractive children, so you're on the upside.
But you're
Like,
completely, yeah.
that's my home run play.
Okay, fine, the worst thing you can is that, like, you're right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, go with that. Okay, so, like, this is kind of, you know, maybe this is what I'm sorry, as far as we're doing what you're doing now, right? So I will think about us just in a long-term relationships, but we have to make decisions, right, in a couple of minutes, or in a couple of conversations. So how can we apply the barbell and the lesser friend to relationship conversations?
They're always, in my opinion, if you've known them for however many days or hours, they are upside plays. They have to be unknown, no data, right? So then we're saying, do we keep them there? Do they end up in the middle? Or, because you might over time realize, oh, there's no upside here. So now they're moving toward the middle, and then are they reliable? Maybe they move over. But in my opinion, anything new, you cannot place it on the reliable side. You can't, so it's upside. And then if it reveals itself not to have upside, now it's in the middle. So will it reveal itself to be reliable? Can we make it reliable? Right? Anything new, we just pile on to it's unknown. The reason oh cool, Douglas James, never met him before. The reason I'm having this conversation is as a client, he represents a new upside, right? Or as a partner or whatever. Because if he didn't, I wouldn't talk to him.
Renee, did you have your hand up earlier?
Oh, I was going to add to the relationship piece. I think from my experience, when you're going through things like this that are super transformational, like you were saying, Nick and Lunch, you're a new person, and especially when it comes to partners and spouses. So, like my husband and I went through something like 5 or 6 years ago, and I was growing and transforming at a speed at a different rate than he was. And I had said to someone, a mentor of mine, what happens when it's your spouse that's the most toxic person in your life? We're stronger now than ever, but it's really hard to be facing those decisions when you have kids. And the thing that helped me the most was someone said to me, how many contracts, and it's, it then becomes transactional when you think of relationships and think of it in this like business contractual sense, but how many contracts you enter into where the terms can never change,
And that was like such a huge, so to the investor frame, that second question, we always kind of remember the first question, but that second question is so powerful because we just renegotiated the terms. It's not that I didn't want to be married anymore, it was I didn't want to be married in these terms, under these terms, right? And most of that came from the growth and self-work that he needed to do, and then the compassion that I needed to grow in as well, and we just negotiated the terms.
I talk about Steve Bogle all the Tom brought it up. I told the story a while ago, and he said it impacted him. But it's the reason I recommend Crucial Conversations. Actually, there's a client we had forever ago, and I went down a rabbit hole trying to figure out how to help him, and I found Crucial Conversations. But I think it's really important as you're growing, and this is by my experience, to it's the same thing over and over. Pick your text. Want to pick the Bible? Great. Jesus couldn't do miracles in his hometown. Same thing over and over is people have a very hard time knowing you as anything other than what they knew you as first. And the reason I think it's important, and the reason I always use old, weird, religious texts or spiritual stuff, is because it is as old as time. And I think it's worth giving people some forgiveness because that's just how we are. And then we work through these frameworks to try to reset the relationships and stuff. But if you grow, it's going to be very, very, very hard. And it's not their fault. They don't know better. They don't even know they're doing it. It's very, very hard for people to see you for what you now are. I just leave industries altogether. I'm just okay, I'm moving. Bye, everyone. It's tough.
I don't remember who the person was that I heard say this, so I can't get the attribution right. But to what you were just sharing, Renee, the quote was something to the effect of, "I've been married 5 times, all to the same person." You familiar with that? And I would say I've been married 3 times at this point, all to the same person. Once when we actually got married, once when we went through infertility, and once just reckoning with what does life now mean with a couple of kids and all that sort of stuff. So there is this kind of re-opting back in that has to occur. They're hey, the terms have changed significantly from when we originally went into this agreement to now. So we both kind of have to declare that we're okay with the new terms. And those are tough, definitely tough conversations to have. But then there is some comfort that I get personally in knowing that it's probably going to happen several more times in my lifetime, and that is not a statement about us. It's not a statement about my wife. It's not a statement about me. It's just an inevitability that we're going to change. And so then we have a choice again in those moments to opt back in or opt out. Hopefully we both opt back in, right? That would be my hope. I think she hopes for the same thing. But she may change enough that she feels differently, right? So I always get comfort in knowing that that's normal and to be expected. It's just you go through we went through all the pre-marriage counseling stuff. Nobody says hey, you're probably going to need to emotionally get remarried 5 times over the course of your relationship. So then you're not ready for it. Correct. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
What else we got? We got a little bit more time. All right. In the meantime, while you think of the next question, just think about if I was to walk away from here today, and I know we're going to probably, most of you will be here tomorrow, what is the thing I wish I would have asked? And Blake knows this. I haven't said this to this group, but we say to the network. The question that you ask is typically not the one that you want to ask. There's typically one question behind that question that you're not really sure if it's appropriate or if it's safe or if you could be that vulnerable. So I recommend, the question behind the question. There's typically one that you ask publicly and there's typically one that you really want to know. Ask the second one. We're here. No, we're streaming to the whole world. It's no big deal. No, very, very small group. But tomorrow we will be here. Probably meet in the lobby. And you guys want to do like earlier? I don't know. What time do people fly out?
Crickets. Crickets.
Yeah, I'm going to get earlier because I know Bill's going to go get everybody drunk tonight. So.
My wife
Yeah.
is watching, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of rhythms,
Yeah, 8.
reasonably.
I got to be done. Probably be done by 12:30. Say 9. 9 a.m. Give us 3.5 hours. Yeah, here. Yeah, not in this room. I'll just be somewhere in this hotel, and you guys have to find me. So, good luck. I'll leave clues.
Yeah, you just look for the Nicorette.
Yeah, you
wrapping
just-
squares.
I'm
That's
gonna
how
leave
I
a
find
trail.
Nick in the office.
Yeah.
I just look for those.
It's my trail of gum packets. No other questions? Cool. Biggest takeaways.
Ben's got a question.
What?
Ben
Yeah,
had a question.
Ben, ask your question. No.
You talked about 70-30 for partnerships. Is it, I'm not totally clear on why you feel like that's good and optimal. Versus
Okay,
say
so-
29 and 10, like 29.
Okay, so absent having done a partnership or worked with someone for a long period of time, I don't do 50-50. And the reason for that is that 50-50 assumes that we're going to equally contribute, but the relationship is too early on, and the nature of the business might be too early on for us to even know what equal contributions might look like. And so you might have conversations early on about roles and responsibilities, but inevitably, regardless of the conversation that's had, there's still an expectation that both people are contributing equally. And so it tends to be a recipe for disaster a year, 2 years in, where one side or both sides feel like the other person isn't contributing their fair share. So, so that's the starting point of why I don't do 50-50. Much less than 30. So then how did I get to 70-30? Much less than 30%, and it's just not interesting enough. Like the monetary rewards are not interesting enough to justify the contribution. And so that's typically my starting point.
So when you guys are looking at partnerships, different forms, should you do around 30% size, or do you have your own? Is that you looking for usually with your?
So I'll tell you my, because I picked up the 70-30 from Dan. It makes a whole lot of sense because he's been in partnerships before, and it needs to be really clear whose baby it is. Right? When it's 50-50, there's a little bit of like, oops, baby dropped in the water. We're both gonna like take the same amount of risk to rescue it, right? It's like, no, it's your baby. You know, and people should go above and beyond to rescue. Like you will risk your life for your baby and not mine, and that makes sense. So to me, it's got to be clear whose baby it is, right? And in my opinion, it could change, but for us and for me personally, for CCA, like I'm not trying to adopt anybody's baby. And that's what happens when, if we were to say, yeah, we want 70, and things get hard, which they're going to, everybody here is a business owner, I think, or has been, it's gonna get hard. And there's going to be shit that nobody wants to do, but that you have to do in order to pull through. Don't look at me like it's my baby, you know? That's not appropriate. So, does that make sense? It's so in 50-50, there's like some, you going in or am I going in? Like, you know, because it's yours too. And so to me, like he told me 70-30, that my brain was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it has to be like, you know, they always say nobody's gonna care about your business like you care about your business because you have this thing that you will do, like just to scratch and claw and care. If I take on a partner, and I mean if we take on a partner, and we're assuming it's a normal one, then like, yeah, we're gonna put a bunch of resources into it, a bunch of cognitive horsepower, connections, all these things we need to help you grow. But not scratching and clawing and doing all the things to rescue something that's not even ours. You know, like technically, I guess legally it might be partially ours, but there's a visceral like ownership that gets really confusing.
We have
with
like
50-50.
weekend visitation rights on the baby, but we don't
Yeah.
have split custody.
Yeah, like if you need a babysitter, well, you know, obviously. But it does need to be clear whose baby it is, in my opinion. It's a good question.
We still got time. What other questions?
Sahana.
It's a question I asked in some pieces, but like the 1750 question is, I'm in a partnership with Sufi. I found the commercial law really easy. My father is the builder, like the initial finances was mine, then my home was on him. His was all practical stuff. So I thought it was fair because I didn't have any skill in commercial real estate or the and now like my home is all clean and it's still 50-50. So what's your thought on our kind of relationship? Basically, I almost went guilty with the 50% because I was so new. Then my dad was like, hey, you took all the financial risk and you could get wiped out, if things go wrong or things like that. So, and my role is like coordinating some of the meetings or just being part of the active role in monitoring the construction and stuff like that. So what are your thoughts on our kind of relationship? So it's technically maybe he's attached to the project and I am too, but I would say he's more attached because he's a developer and he's really probably one of his favorite successful projects. So there's a little twist to that partnership question.
I'll tell you, bro, because this is really something that this kind of stuff are things that I use. I keep saying it, broad strokes, and then like the things I carry over to Dan's office, and I'm like, hey, help me refine this. One, there's a little bit of like mentality stuff that I think you should probably like sit down and you know, like Dan had a good point, because this guilt and this shame and all this stuff, it doesn't really. You're not going to make good decisions from that, you know? Because, yeah, one person might be out there sweating their face off and they know everything, but it doesn't happen without the finance. And the truth is, if you have the money, it's probably easier to find a builder than it is for the builder to find the money. So I would just try to figure out how to bypass the guilt and the shame. But if I had this feeling, and I've had this feeling before, and this is what I tried to do, is I don't really want to carry all of this. I've done the math. I understand my contribution. Could I, and Dan can tell me why this doesn't make sense because it's not something we've talked about at length. I would, just to get rid of the bandwidth of like, you know, it's kind of more your baby and you're kind of doing all the work now. And I would see if I could get him, or some version of, to buy 20% from me. And then it's 70-30. I don't even care, you know, I mean, you figure out how much. You know, if that, you got to think, like, I'm making a bunch of assumptions, but if that would give you a little bit of like, okay, now it's like mainly his thing, but we still did right by you. Like, you can't just give stuff away that you very clearly earned and deserve. So, you know, either navigate how to be okay with 50-50, or if 70-30, 80-20, whatever, makes you feel like you're still going to get an appropriate return for what you've put in and also feel a lot better about it, I would, that's the first place my brain goes.
Yeah, so 70-30, that would have been my starting point. Still feel strongly you put in all the capital. Now, there's an infinite number of ways that we could structure this, right? And so at the end of the day, if he or she is motivated for 50-50, then how do we turn this into a win-win? Well, what we know with the risks of these construction projects is that it goes long and the costs go up significantly. Now, at this point, he has no motivation because you're financing all of it. So 70-30, but you get 50% if you meet this criteria, right? You get it done on time, you fall within this budget range. I don't know, making up variables. So, or he gets, maybe you start at 70-30 equity and it flips to 30, 70, but it's all performance based. Because the risk otherwise is that, yeah, they put in the blood, sweat, and tears, but you're putting in all the capital, so who really has more to lose? This isn't his only project, I recall, either. He has a bunch of other projects, and there was a little bit of stealing from Peter to pay Paul type scenario, right? So that's because you have more to lose than he has to lose. So I would write the rules in future deals that you can get to the 50-50 if that's what he wanted. It's like, my terms are 50-50. Okay, well, we can get there, but you have to conform to these rules I'm going to set.
Well, his contribution, when you write this, when you write the operating agreement, and I haven't written many operating agreements, I don't even look at them. I just sign them and hope that I'm not getting screwed.
Well, first legal gets terrified because you're out of office,
Yeah.
and then they email me and they're like, "Hey, is Nick doing okay?"
Yeah.
Can you
My
tell me?"
autoresponder stresses a lot of people out.
Yeah, especially legal.
Dan's like, it works, because he's like, I didn't even copy you on the email because I don't want them getting your autoresponder.
It's true. That's a
Success.
fact. Yeah.
But remember, I think there's a thing to, and I think that's brilliant. I'll put the capital forward, 70-30. Your contribution is your performance. My contribution is cash, is performance. So these are the things, like, this is how you deliver on that contribution, and if you deliver, then it flips, right? Because when you have an operating agreement, you can have one person provide capital, one person provide intellectual property, another person provides boots on the ground, right? But how do we make sure that the capital, the intellectual property, the boots on the ground, it's all an equal amount if we were 33. Like, you have to define that. So my contribution is $150,000, and yours is building. Well, building what? In what time frame? By when? So I think defining that would be really important. If nothing else, you have leverage if they don't deliver. But otherwise, there is a risk that it just keeps, if it's just, well, I fund it and you do the work, you're taking a way bigger risk if those were the terms. Because they could just keep working and spending.
Yeah.
Do they,
Blake, would
out of-
you have something to add, Blake?
out of curiosity, sorry, Blake, out of curiosity, are they asking for more funding? Okay. Okay.
No more cash flow, ever had it either.
One thing I was going to summarize is what's tied in here, which what the guys are saying would address it, but I think just to connect the dots is this perspective that the amount of hours of hard work that he puts in are worthy of more, right? So you're looking at effort, and you're saying, I'm not putting in an effort, and he's putting in all this effort.
That's
And
old
so
mindset, right?
there's like belief systems sitting underneath there that the value comes from hard work or the amount of energy, time, effort spent versus the perspective that the guys are coming from, which is the quality comes from results. You're providing the results, they have to provide the results. So just connect the dots there for you because you don't see that you have this belief system underneath, right? It's gonna keep coming up and keep coming up and keep coming up and you're gonna try and apply it, but every time you're gonna run into this continuous spiral because in your relationships, especially if you're doing it with someone who's doing the work, you're gonna overemphasize the effort they're putting in and not judge them on the thing that you actually need to judge them on, which is are you actually bringing your equal part to the relationship by showing up your results. Does that make sense?
So it comes probably from, being a career person and also the belief of you work hard to get to where you want, all of those things.
And that's
now
why
in
you
a business where it's so different,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, and so if you don't deal with that, you're gonna consistently feel guilty and undervalue everything that you do because you're not gonna feel that you're actually working. And you're gonna overvalue the other person, and then that's where you end up with the incompetence and all of that stuff, that cycle. So I think the framework you're using is really brilliant because it addresses that. But if you don't have the self-awareness that you're doing that behavior, you'll still do it, and you'll be trying to implement what they're doing with a lot of resistance. That's exactly
A fair. I talked about this in one of the next businesses. I wrote a newsletter about this. Effort is cool. Like, effort's great.
I like effort. I want to hire people that have high level of effort. But the value exchange is money for production, right? So like if I pay somebody, I say, Dan, can you make me a pool in front of my house? And I'm like, hey, can you
Turns
make
out
me
I
a pool in front of my other house, Douglas? And like, I pay $200,000 each. Yeah. Dan shows up with like a backhoe and just builds the fucking pool. Very little physical effort on his part, and it gets done. And I'm like, cool, this pool's sweet. I go to my other house, and Douglas is out there digging with a tiny garden shovel, you know, and just grinding his face off. Am I going to be like, wow, I should give Douglas more money because he's putting more effort into it? Like, no, motherfucker, I paid you the same as him, and the thing didn't get done, right? So production is what the value exchange is. Oftentimes, higher effort means more production, but they're not synonymous. So we value, like, it's what you're doing essentially is being like, oh man, look how hard Douglas is working. He's providing more value to this. Really, he's actually providing quite a bit less value because he got a 2 foot by 2 foot hole, where over here I got a pool from Dan.
I know how to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you'd rather somebody actually be able to use less effort, give the results of less effort, because that means they're gonna be more efficient, which means they can focus on other things. I think this is like corporate mentality and sometimes how we talk about things is really broken. Right? I would much rather hire the person that can get the job done in a week than hire the person that's gonna take a month.
Yeah. Yeah, so Nick and I were just talking about, so a common thing that we experienced, especially end of last year, was that several folks who were coming with these great business ideas, but the ask was some version of like a crypto hedge fund that maybe you guys have heard us talk about. And the ask was, hey, could you guys get the whole legal structure figured out, and then could you contribute the IP, because we want to do this sort of strategy combination, tax harvesting and staking, and then could you bring in all the clients as well?
Yeah.
And like we're thinking like 100 million under asset management like the first 6 months or so. And so what we're thinking is we're like, okay, yeah, like, yes, we can, but we don't want to operate on an ongoing basis. So we said, yeah, we think we can deliver on all 3 of those things. Yes. And we don't want to operate on an ongoing basis. So we're just going to take 30%. And what do you think that they said back? That doesn't seem fair to us because you're not going to be operating the business on an ongoing basis. So we're okay with you getting 30% initially, but we think that should go to 0 after a couple of years. Okay, so that's not actually too dissimilar from what you're describing, right? Which is, hey, can you make this whole thing possible? And then I should get my fair share because I'm putting in the hours. Like, well, the fund wouldn't even have existed if we didn't create the entity structure, the IP and the clients. Just replace that with putting in all the money. The project doesn't exist unless we put in all the money. Right? But our mentality comes back to, but I'm doing all the work.
So, one, they're already doing all the work right now. They want intellectual property, all this stuff, right? So I'll tell you why it's ridiculous and why it's dangerous is we generally, humans, tend to overvalue effort. That's not something people say often because effort's important, kind of. Like winning is important. Getting the job done is important. And yeah, like if you actually want to do that at a high level, you have to put forth effort. That's a necessary thing. But if you value effort, you're missing the point, right? Because one of the statements that I heard when we were on a call was like, so like, well, what about like, let's say 3 years from now, and you guys aren't like actively putting effort into it? Like, you know how much money they lost out on because they were so worried, not about the outcome of having a $100 million fund overnight, but because they were valuing a fair amount of effort, which is completely subjective, right? So just very careful. Outcome, absolutely. Outcome that is the value exchange. You are providing capital for an outcome.
Yeah.
off land or we would have those, there's just no cash flows on it, so it's, that process is better.
Yeah.
Understand my values.
I do think it still comes back to characterize the problem, is when we could take the whole crypto hedge fund as an example here. So just to summarize, you would like me to do all the work up front, but then you don't want me to benefit from the value long term. Like, just so we're on the same page. Like, well, yeah, but that's what we're saying essentially. Yeah. Okay, well,
Like, cool, I get it. Me
cool.
too.
I totally understand why you would want that.
Yeah,
And
good deal.
I have some I have some feedback for you, and we should just hang up
Yeah,
now
just so
before
you
we go
guys,
through that.
just throwing it out there. If any of you want to build something that is going to be cash flow positive from start to finish, and then just give it to us and keep none of it, 100%.
Totally.
I'm extending that offer right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you just package up all of your intellectual property and get all the initial funding, and then like not want anything, it'd be cool. I'd appreciate that. It'd be a good deal.
This conversation was so helpful because I'm in another syndication relationship where he pays me as an employee. So
You bring in funds and you get a little bit at the beginning, then it's not good. The same people will be in those positions. Like I said, for your efforts not there afterwards, is exactly what you told me. To get, a person to make a function afterwards. It's like, I gotta like renegotiate a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna work with it.
100%.
There you go. Yeah, you guys build the business, right? And then you give it to us and you take none of it.
Perfect.
So 70-30 or 100-0. Both of those are on the table.
Alright. So I have a question. So kind of going through all of this, how do we do like a kind of like God versus the topic, right? Let's just say. So if I'll give a great example. So I was being approached me and they're like, hey, I want you to help me to build this group of people that are interested in buying real estate, buying businesses. So I'm like, okay, I'm listening. Let's have this conversation. And so he's like, I do automation, so I'm going to provide all of the automation and bring all of the people in, but I want you to run it. I'm like, okay, so so basically he's like, I want to put zero effort in other than like creating all of this automation, and so and then he wants to like split everything 50-50. But I'm
Yeah.
putting in 100% of the effort. I'm like, so it's like, how do you value
It's actually
time and then capital?
it's actually pretty simple in this case, in my opinion. You go find somebody that will build all those automations for you, and you get a quote, and that tells you how valuable those automations are. If he goes, yeah, I did that for 15 grand, like cool, then we know it's a $15,000 contribution, and I probably wouldn't give 50% of my profits ongoing for something that I'll just pay this guy 15 grand to do it instead. So sometimes it's, now if they come and Brandon's building Success Finder, right? So if I was a developer and he wanted to build it and it was going to cost $400,000 for me to do it, and like, holy shit, I can't afford that. Well, then maybe I could be like, well, hey, why don't you give me some equity? Give me half of it. And so it's like, what does it cost to have this done? You go to 3 places and get an average, and that's the value of the work.
Similar to the place, since we're providing the capital and doing 100% of all of the effort, like how do you determine where that line is as far as like the equity side? I mean, obviously I understand like the 70-30, but like in that scenario, like how would you determine that?
Well, I would start with I'm not interested in doing this, like unless I get at least 70%. Because the recognition is back to like confidence from 6 Lessons from 6 Sons is you need me to do this. And so my terms are at least 70%. And that's the starting point. Now, if you want to be a dick about it, we can start at 90%. I don't always say it. Sometimes I say that. But So understanding your authority and leverage. See, this is what, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic now, but this is what's going to happen as all of you grow your authority and many of you are already masters in your areas of domain, right? Is that people are going to come to you with these great ideas. I have this great idea. Can you run that business for me and I can take a portion of it? Like,
I know where this conversation was done.
but this, we have no data to support that this idea is even going to manifest into an ongoing business. And so there's, again, trying to I tend to oversimplify, and this does tend to trigger people, and Nick watches this happen on a regular basis, which is like, again, so what I'm trying, just so I understand what you're telling me, you have an idea, and you would like me to run with that idea and do all the work and get all the clients, and in return for you giving me that idea, I should give you half. Is that what you're saying? Yes. Okay. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
If you'd like to counteroffer, this is why we don't go first in our partnership dealings as well, is because someone might come back with something so ridiculous that you just don't counteroffer, and we feel like we can take that offer and not turn it into something personal and get into like a pissing competition back and forth. Like, okay, 50-50, yeah, I'm not even interested. Would be my counteroffer. Right? And then it's on them to come back with, because they're the one who's chasing you. Right? They need you to make this happen. Right? So you have the authority in that position to leverage. So come to me with something that's, from what you've offered right now, we're just going to pass.
Do you know why, generally speaking, there's a lot of reasons, but it's typically ill-advised for professional athletes to represent themselves? Yeah, because in a true, if we're really working at a market, we're running a business, and we're operating at a market norm, and we're trying to do the best we can to build a team, and they're trying to, it gets offensive. Athlete says, I want this much, and owner tells them all the reasons they're not worth that much, and it hurts really. So if we go, hey, make an offer, and we already know that, we know our range, you're 70% or more, and they go, yeah, I think, we maybe 12%, you just stop. Because you're just going to start offending each other. That's all that's going to happen. So we try to make the other party go first, and if it's not with it, because then we get, not interested. Totally preserve this relationship. We can still do business together, but as soon as you start trying to convince somebody you're worth 70 and they're starting at 12, you're just going to piss each other off. It's the only thing that can happen. So just.
Cal?
I got a question. This is kind of a second tier question I'm probably really trying to ask. This should have probably been asked on the first NCCA degree, but maybe I'm looking for maybe some probing questions to help me with some clarity on the question, what are you really trying to accomplish and what matters most? To get real back to the basics of it, I have troubles with those questions, answering, finding that clarity in there. I'm kind of I want to bring it all with me. I want my cake and eat it too. I want fulfillment of being very productive. Maybe the identity behind that, but also I do enjoy that. I've lived a life of, free skiing for more than 40% of the year and hunting all over. I've had that luxury as well. I've lived both sides. So this is these are really tough questions.
Mine is very, very simple. I have Wolfie socks, by the way. Mine is very, very simple. I just remembered. I just saw them. It's very, very simple. See, I'm a very simple person, as you can. This is very exciting.
This is what Nick is trying to accomplish.
This is the this is
Wolfie
the
socks money.
I'll tie in my Wolfie socks to my answer. This works for some people. It doesn't work for others. If you're more fact finder, detail oriented. But this was said to me once, and I can come back to it, and it orients me quickly. And I said it in Nick Smith 2020, I think, and I call it a conversation with death. Cal on his deathbed. Do you really give a shit if you did this or not?
You know, like what? That's the conversation. You really go, man, I really wish that I would have been busier during the day. You know, maybe. But that orients me pretty quickly, and that's all that personally I need is like Nick on his deathbed. Yeah, he probably doesn't care if I do more of this. You know, he probably doesn't care what car I drove. He just won't. So I start there, and that's enough to orient. At least get me started really thinking about, even day to day, week to week. It's like, oh man, I really want to do this thing because I saw Mario has like 5 Lamborghinis now, so I want 5 Lamborghinis now. But then, you know, for me, it's like, Nick on his deathbed, does he give a shit if I had a Lamborghini? No, he doesn't. Okay. And like that's enough to just get the crap out of there that I think I want to take with me, you know.
That helps when you try to have that kind of more conversation around people. I have recently had a real conversation there, integrated I used to work on that 3 years ago. So that, you know, these are real questions that I have, but it still is a challenging question because I come out of it like I'm still swinging for the fences. I want to go and I want to, I want to spend that time with family and I want to do all of it. So it's hard to get that clear picture. And I think I foresee this always coming up at different stages of my life. What does it look like? What that does.
So you might consider shortening the timeline. So it might be, what am I trying to accomplish today, or this week, or this month? Most of us, I don't actually think, have the benefit of having clarity on this is exactly what I want for my life. And if we do, then we usually find out later that we were wrong because life changes and we evolve, and what we thought we wanted is now something different. And some of us then go through this shame-guilt cycle of how didn't I see that beforehand, right? But really it's just evolving and changing. I think about things in terms of relative priority, because I think that's it's harder to explain, but I think easier to apply once you understand it, which is based off what I know today. What are the things that I want, and then can I weight them? So sometimes, just as a really simple example, sometimes, like I know that I want money, but money, you know, time, energy, let's just use those currencies, time, influence, money. At times in my life, money might be the number one priority, and it might be 5 times more important than time, and that might be 10 times more important than influence, but just for like the next month, because there's something I want to buy, which means I have to be, if it's money focused, I got to be spending my time on, I don't know, getting more clients or getting the work done. All right, so I usually go through this exercise of like listing out the things that I want, and then based off today or this week or this month, depending on the mood that I'm in, to be honest with you, and how much clarity I have, I'll rank them, but applying a weight. So what's my number one? And then how many times more important is that than the number 2? And how many times more important? And suddenly you realize when you get to the bottom of the list is that there's things on there that really on a relative basis aren't that important, but had you not done the exercise, you would have put a lot of time toward it. Does that make sense? So I think the shift I'm suggesting is recognizing that it's going to shift. And for you, it might be day to day, it might be week to week, it might be month to month. It might be, hey, you know what, I've done this for a while, and in the winter, skiing is always 10 times more important than everything else. Right? So now you just know that rhythm that you have and so then you can anticipate and kind of rebalance accordingly. So
I tend to be less aspirational, you know. I'm a little bit like, if you're at bumpers, I'm a little bit more like avoid bad things. So you can invert and also not just, you can, that's why I wrote bumpers actually, was like, you can use non-negotiables to start to figure that out. You know, I refuse that for my kids to feel like I wasn't present when I was home. And that informs some decisions as far as relative priority, right? And then you go, well, you know, can I still accomplish? I refuse that. So if you have a list of non-negotiables, you can at least have those to weigh your decisions against. And bumpers, you just operate in there.
Did that give you some clarity or create
Yeah,
more
those are-
consternation?
Those are absolutely great add-on questions to help me.
Cool.
There are personalities, absolutely personalities. The whole operating system is it's like a guiding principles, and it's different for everybody. There are absolutely personalities that just probably like yours, that just like the freedom to just kind of do whatever today or tomorrow, understanding that, yeah, I think I'm gonna want to do this tomorrow, and then you wake up tomorrow and you're like, actually, I really want to do this other thing, and like that's totally appropriate. And so it may not be a super, like Dan was saying, it may not be a super clear, these are my priorities. And so it's more like just saying, that's cool. Total permission to operate that way. Avoid bad things and operate that way. Those are people that are typically, just to be transparent, probably extreme. You do a lot of extreme sports, right? They probably are the personalities that become addicts or do extreme sports and stuff. So it's,
Goes back to the one education.
yeah,
I do want that, but I do want
yeah.
So we're not gonna kill one of these. Or maybe
Yeah, it may be you have your cake in some seasons and you eat it on other seasons. Yeah. And like that's cool. The avoid bad things, right? So it's recognizing when doing both puts you at a very high risk of something really bad happening that we want to avoid, in my opinion. But I'm super cyclic. If you've been in my world long enough, you might know that. Dan knows that. When I moved to Seattle, he's like, yeah, I expect you to be here for 2 years and leave. So I'm probably on a longer time frame, but I just have these cycles. Just don't fight them. Just try to make sure I'm aware of them so I don't blow myself up.
Lucas.
trying to conceptualize a profit priority way down the line, like this is what I want, and I'm going to project, like I'm going to do that. It's tough. Even a couple of years down the line, much less like 5 or 10. And I used to think that I just couldn't use the shit that you were doing because I wasn't like diligent enough, or like I wasn't that kind of person. But for me, what really clicked for me was a couple key points. The first one was treating the floor like the floor, and so raising the floor is actually a floor. Like that's as low as you could ever go, and working on raising that, because that's no matter what you choose to do in your orientation, which direction you choose to go, your floor is your floor. For me, that's helped a lot. Like when that clicked for me, I'm like, okay, I need MRR, because if I'm not dealing with a certain amount of predictable revenue in my company, then I'm going to have to constantly go through these promotion cycles. So instead, I can go through my promotion cycles, but sell everybody into a payment plan instead of a spike. And that helped me get that floor raised so that I feel much more calm, and now my net worth is higher. So, that helped in terms of like orienting, constructing, and stuff like that. And then the flip side is because I don't know how you operate, but for me, I also noticed that even though I want to orient towards concepts, like I want to get my PhD. I don't have a thing of like, I want to get my PhD in this amount of time at this university. Right now, I'm just operating. I want a PhD, and these are kind of my reasons for it. So I'm doing these directions, orientations, kind of, thing. And same thing with other life goals. And I've had to reorganize a lot based on some of the recent stuff that's happened in my life. But that floor, and then realizing that even though I feel kind of chaotic, I'm actually habitual at certain layers. Like I don't know you personally, but you might be able to think of things you do habitually, things that like every day or every week or every month or whatever you can. Oh yeah, I do that all the time. And for me, Dr. Cashin is the one that kind of like initially opened my eyes to like, oh no, I really do only do like 3 or 4 or 5 different things, or this is what I order when I eat out. I think I need variety. I'm always going to these 4 restaurants, or I order these things, or I have these habits, and noticing that I can raise the floor, and that if I have habits, I can tweak those habits, allowed me to stay chaotic or have orientations rather than plans, while still using all of these principles, but kind of playing my own version of it. So I don't have the spreadsheets, I don't have that kind of thing, but for me it's helped a lot. I don't know if that's helpful for you, but it's kind of how I managed to switch it.
There's at a really high level. There's different personality types, but I think solvable problem and prioritizing is important because we are all useless humans without it. So like we're aiming creatures. We have to aim at something, and we have to know if we're maximizing our happiness, right? We have to aim at something, and we have to know when to take risk off the table. But ultimately, that's what the search. In my opinion, Dan shares his first time he shares solvable problem in the operating system. It's just a framework for all different personalities. Some people are going to sit down and they're going to fill out the search the app every day, and they're just gonna. Other people just have these general frameworks, but it's like, where am I aiming, and when do I take risk off the table so that I don't blow myself up and not get things that make me happy? That's ultimately, in my view, that's what we're trying to do here. Is aim at something, understand we're going to adjust, but we got to aim at something. And then when do we know, like, how do we inform ourselves on when to take less risk? And you're naturally a risk taker, so you're going to be more extreme in some of the stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. And to Lucas's point, I just want to point out, I don't know if you guys know this, even when you think you are super random and chaotic, if we just took a drone and like filmed you for like 6 months, you do like almost this, on the days where like, I'm totally random, I'm a wild card, you do the same, like 90% of the same shit every day. So if you identify that stuff, it tells you a lot. I need variety, as you say. And people are always like, I eat the same thing every day because I don't care. People are like, I can't believe you do that. I need variety. And if you actually just observe, they eat the same like 5 ingredients every day. So there's a little bit about really understanding the consistencies in your behavior that you might not be aware of that might inform quite a bit about what your priorities are and all that fun stuff. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do that. Goals to going at and getting there. There's an obnoxious amount of opportunity.
Yeah.
So that I can kind of finish going that. So I feel like I know like that does
But I first heard it from Dan. I think he articulates it better. Theory of constraints. Same shit over and over. Is, can we prioritize? And again, I heard this from Dan first. It's a gut check. Can we prioritize? And after we prioritize, are we willing to put all resources number one priority? Most people don't, for many reasons. But there's this weird thing where anytime I've had this conversation, they're like, "Well, isn't there a world where I can have it all?" Like, yeah, there is, sure. But you actually have the highest probability of having it all by channeling all resources to the first priority and checking that off, then the next one, because right, the alternative is you take all your resources and you split them in 5 different ways, and you're very unlikely to fund any of them that way because something's going to happen. You're going to run out of resources. You got like 5 half-funded priorities. So it's like, can we prioritize? Am I willing to put all available resources to this thing? If not, it's not actually my number one priority. It's like, that's the gut check moment. But in theory of constraints, they have these huge, they talk to these huge corporations and they run into the same problem. They're like, well, we got one team for this and one team for this and one team for this and one team for this. I don't know if we're going to make it. It's like, well, actually, you just put all those teams on the number one priority, and the probability that you achieve all these things skyrockets.
So there's a little bit about like, if it's FOMO that I'm going to miss these opportunities, you actually will almost always, and Dan can speak to this better than I can, but you have a much higher probability of having your cake and eating it too by prioritizing and allocating resources to number one priority. It just feels like, by picking one, you're forfeiting the others. When in reality, by picking all of them, you might also be forfeiting all of them. It's weird.
We have a video out there somewhere where I went through the math on how resource allocation of how we're trying to go for everything at once, and how mathematically you increase the probability of none of it happening. But if you did, to Nick's point, just optimize for the main thing and then move to the next and sort of rebalance, with that, you get there faster. And so as humans who we're all tend to bias towards more, it's hard to embrace that sort of mentality. But truly, if you want it all, if you're like, I truly want it all, then you would optimize for the main thing and then move to the next. So we can probably find that video if you haven't seen it.
It's Lunaded, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we did it for Lunaded.
Yeah, I built out some spreadsheet live, real time in the conversation.
Then the question really is, do I actually want to accomplish all these things, or do I want to do all of these things? Those are different priorities. If you just want to experience all these things all at the same time for whatever reason, it's fine. Then you forfeit the right to complain if you don't achieve them all. Or do you want to finish all these things? Those are different things. Like, cool, Like maybe you want to try all these things and it's not really that important that you quote unquote finish or fund them. If the most important thing is that you fund them, then the highest probability way of actually doing that is prioritizing them.
Better way for me to be clear on, so I'm moving some of these, I'm trying to do them all, picking up the other things in here on this side. And I do have one or two priorities, I'll probably have a lot clearer picture of what does matter most, what am I really trying to accomplish.
If you want to do, again, we're over time already, but if you want to do truly extraordinary things where they feel almost impossible, highest probability is generally going to be sequencing them, prioritizing, and so not necessarily by most important, which that would be where I start, but you can sequence in that, like, this thing would give me more authority if I actually accomplish this, right? And more authority would actually make this thing exponentially easier, right? So you're actually, again, it's theory of constraints, you're actually removing constraints as you accomplish things. Or optimize before you maximize, where you can say, well, if I actually accomplish this thing, whatever, if you did something and it was like, well, I would then be world famous for accomplishing this, I'd have all the authority in the world, it'd actually be much easier to accomplish this thing. So, right, sequencing, and if you did it in the reverse order, it'd be much harder, because you'd have the authority after the. So you can also just prioritize, like just find a way, in my mind, find a way to justify allocating all resources to one thing. And that's typically how we think about things, is like, what's a sequence? If it's not obvious in priority, it's, well, what is the thing that we can direct our resources to that unlocks the most amount of capital or whatever that would make the next thing easier? So it's not always, obvious what the priority is, but this thing unlocks a ton of free cash flow, which makes this thing easier. Or this thing unlocks authority, which makes this thing easier. So you can also sequence strategically, and then it's easier to me to justify putting all resources into one thing, knowing that unlocking that one thing makes everything else easier.
So the follow-up question I have, and you don't have to answer it now, but do you actually want it all, or is there some feeling that you get in the moment that you're trying to experience? Like there's some rush, or some emotion, or like I want to feel like I'm doing something huge. I want to feel like I'm spontaneous. I don't want to feel held down by, like, is there something that is like the step past that I want it all? Like, why do you want it all, I guess?
Yeah, it's
Because you might be optimizing for the wrong thing. In other words, you might be trying to accomplish these 10 things, but really you want some you want to experience something from life that could be produced without trying to do these 10 things.
I think it goes from my focus to where I'm at, and go really hard further, and be able to see,
You know?
and if I go at it right now business, and I wrap it all up in that, like, we have to do all of this stuff. So it's kind of a driven, without being driven on focus, I guess.
Blake has a thing.
I've been sitting here thinking this for about 5 minutes. So years ago, probably one of the biggest unlocks that it gave me was an understanding of my own personal cycles. And when we had that conversation, it helped me understand why I would go through these cycles of like, this is amazing, everything's great, and then I would get to this point where then I would find myself like a little frustrated, and then I would go into like the depths of despair, frustration, lack of clarity, and I was going through this stuff. So that's what you're saying. What I kept feeling was that you have these cycles, but you don't understand, you're not optimizing for the cycle. Because once Nick and I sat down and really helped me understand, oh, this is the cycle you go through, your cycles every 3 months, this is what you're experiencing. Then I could back up and say, oh, I've had that cycle at about 6 or 9 months in corporate, and I was going through that same exact cycle. And then we were able to actually dissect and understand, okay, what are the things that are positive inputs that enable you to be happy? What's happening in the middle that's creating the downward spiral? And then how do you actually optimize your normal cadence so that you don't go into these in-depth spirals? So for me, right, learning, education, relationships, really big. So it's like you need to be at events for getting some new input at least every 3 months, right? And then I would go into cycles of doing, and I'm not an implementer, and that I would be in doing way too long, which would then take me down, right? And then I have no new learning or no new input. So what I was hearing from you was sort of the cycle of going all in, and then you have all of these problems on the back end, where you're overloaded, et cetera. So I wonder if there may be some cycles in there that are creating a feeling that you're not getting what you want because you're actually not optimizing for the cycles you need for how you work best. Does that make sense?
It does. Some of it though, I get eventually rewarded with, like, I do end up with a lot of things. A lot of hard work in that was grinding, we'll say, and that's the risk of blowing myself up. But yeah, so I could kind of eventual reward with like trying to arrive at the answer between what you had said Dan's question. But
Which is what Dan was gonna ask me is what's the emotional tie, right? So I think there's an answer in looking at what is it you're seeking and what's the pattern and how can I improve the floor, raise the floor to stop doing the things that are then getting me off on what I want to do. Because once I understood that, it was like, oh, you need to be learning something new, you need to get out of a longer implementation cycle. It made a massive difference for me.
I think, and I agree, I think if I could just speak candidly, do I have permission?
yeah.
Okay. I think you have a high level, you seek dopamine. And what I appreciate about you in particular is that you get it through effort. That's very good.
When you ask the question, because it's hard.
Yeah. So I think way maybe overgeneralization, I think you probably have the personality of an addict. You like, seek dopamine. A lot of extreme athletes do. They went the much healthier route, which is they get their dopamine through effort, which is awesome because the alternative is very dangerous. Get your dopamine without effort. And so I think if you know that about yourself, and you can cool, that's what I do. That's what I need. That's how I get it. Then it really is a process of over time defining that direction and not blowing yourself up. Really, because I think there's a risk, and again, I could be wrong. There's a risk in saying, hey, Cal, slow down, stop, prioritize, and it manifests as a less healthy way to get the dopamine. Like social media, crypto, obsessions, drugs, stuff like that. So there's just a knowing yourself that
You know, there are people that absolutely are going to have their solvable problem, and they're just methodically going to work towards it, and that might not be you, because that just doesn't make you happy. So in that case, it's probably just an ongoing, like, just keep mitigating the risk so you don't blow yourself up. And over time, just direction, you know. I don't think you have to know what that is, but it's a little bit, I appreciate, because you do activity and stuff. It's very confusing. But no, I appreciate the fact that it's clear to me that, like, you like to put effort into things and then get rewarded. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's something that we want to say, here's an operating system so that you stop doing that.
PD.
Cal and I had an opportunity to chat. You said something to me that stuck out. It was a short little phrase you used that stuck out to me. It triggered something because it's something that I remember thinking similarly myself. It was you need to catch up. You are operating from any system of needing to catch up to whatever catching up is. You have caught yourself in a vicious loop, right? So Nick said, you operate in this place where effort creates this dopamine, right? And for some particular reason, the effort is triggered by needing to catch up. What is it you need to catch up to? Probably a question you could ask yourself. But in reality, when you're playing the catch-up game, you are losing. You've already started from a losing position because you're trying to catch up. And you're coming from a place of desperation and neediness, which definitely doesn't get you anywhere that you want to be. Right? So maybe this effort is just misplaced. It could be put in a place that's not coming from I need to catch up, and it's totally content with where you are and exploring where that is versus trying to exploit the next thing very quickly. Just some thoughts.
Right, and that was the situational.
But
It could be applicable to.
Right, it was situational, but it was an emotion that you experienced in a circumstance.
It created a reaction that happened.
That created a reaction that was your default. Right, and so you've got to be able to accept that and be like, where else is this happening? Maybe it's not as extreme, maybe it's not as a negative consequence or result from it, but it's still happening. And maybe since you're not getting the negative result, you're not paying attention to it, and it's manifesting in other places. Right?
And it could be a very early childhood experience. You might not even have it in your memory. Still, sometimes it's some small silly experience under the age of 7 a lot of times. That certain belief system got stuck with you.
Sure.
So that's like only a lot of cleaning up the onions kind of things. We would in different situations. Say for myself, she was telling me about that for a while. It's training. Yeah, it's unlearning things.
Great discussion. Nick, any final words of wisdom?
I have no final words of wisdom. I appreciate the discussion, though. This is my favorite part, it's the dialogue. So we'll carry it on tomorrow. If you're remote, you don't get to be here. But if you're, we'll do 9 a.m. tomorrow, and we'll just carry on the discussion.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone.